Close your eyes and let the noise of the modern world slowly fade away. Tonight, we travel back into one of the darkest chapters in human history, to a man who rarely raised his voice, who avoided the spotlight, and yet helped build a system of fear that reached into every corner of society. His name was Heinrich Himmler. He did not lead armies on the front lines. He was not known for fiery speeches or dramatic gestures. Instead, he worked quietly, methodically, obsessively. And in that silence, something far more dangerous took shape. Because Himmler was not just a man, he was an organizer, a believer in structure, order and control. Under his direction, the SS transformed from a small guard unit into one of the most powerful and feared organizations in Nazi Germany. A machine that did not rely on chaos, but on precision, on paperwork, on obedience, and behind closed doors, far from the eyes of the public. Another force grew in the shadows, the Gestapo, a secret police network that turned neighbors into informants, that erased trust and replaced it with fear. But how does something like this happen? How does an ordinary man become the architect of such a system? Was it ideology, ambition, or something deeper, something far more unsettling? Tonight, as you drift slowly towards sleep, we will explore the life of Heinrich Himmler, from his early years to his rise within the Nazi regime, and the system he helped create. A system built not on sudden violence, but on gradual control. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let the story unfold. Because this is not just history. This is the story of how power operates in silence. He was not a soldier nor a conqueror in the traditional sense, and yet few men have ever wielded such terrifying power over life and death. Himmler, the quiet, bespectacled former chicken farmer, who rose to become one of the most feared figures in the modern world, was the architect of the Nazi terror machine, the man who built the SS, commanded the Gestapo, and orchestrated the Holocaust. Behind his calm voice and bureaucratic precision lay a mind obsessed with purity, obedience, and control. He saw himself not as a monster, but as a visionary, a builder of a new world guided by ideology, mysticism, and the ruthless efficiency of death. The story of Himmler is not just the story of a man, but of a system that turned ordinary functionaries into executioners and an empire of lies into an instrument of annihilation. This is the story of Heinrich Himmler, the quiet engineer of terror and the man who turned ideology into extermination. To understand Himmler is to understand the machinery of the Third Reich itself. Born in 1900 to a middle-class Bavarian family, he was raised in discipline and devotion, but also in frustration. He was not charismatic like Hitler, nor brilliant like Goebbels or Goering. He was methodical, insecure, and obsessed with order. After the chaos of Germany's defeat in World War I, Himmler sought meaning in the rising tide of nationalism and racial myth. When he joined the Nazi Party in 1923, he found both purpose and belonging. He was drawn not only to its politics, but to its mysticism, its vision of a racially pure world shaped by destiny and hierarchy. Within a few short years, he rose through the ranks of the fledgling Schutzstaffel, the SS, at first little more than a ceremonial guard for Hitler. But under Himmler's leadership, the SS would transform into a state within a state, a disciplined, fanatical order devoted not to Germany, but to the Führer himself. Himmler was no warrior, yet his genius lay in organization. He built the SS with the precision of an engineer and the zeal of a priest. Every member was indoctrinated in loyalty, racial ideology, and personal sacrifice. The black uniform, the runic insignia, the rigid hierarchy, all bore his touch. To Himmler, the SS was not just a military force. It was a racial elite, a brotherhood bound by blood and obedience. It would soon grow into a sprawling empire controlling police, intelligence, colonization, and the machinery of terror. In 1934, after the Night of the Long Knives, Himmler's power exploded. The Gestapo, the secret state police, came under SS control, and the rivals of Hitler's regime were eliminated. From that moment, Himmler became one of the most powerful men in Germany, the silent overseer of the Reich's inner workings, the master of fear. Under Himmler's guidance, the SS expanded its reach into every corner of German life. He built the Waffen-SS, the military wing that would fight alongside the Wehrmacht, and yet remain ideologically pure. Soldiers trained not only in war, but in the creed of the master race. On the battlefield, they earned a reputation for discipline, ferocity, and fanaticism. In occupied Europe, they became the embodiment of terror. But Himmler's real domain lay in the shadows, in the camps, the prisons, the files, and the trains. He oversaw the creation of the concentration camp system, at first designed for political enemies, and later transformed into an apparatus of industrialized murder. Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz each began as an extension of Himmler's vision of control. Each was a piece of his empire where ideology and efficiency fused into horror. Himmler was not a raving madman. He was worse. He was rational. He spoke of genocide as if it were administration, of extermination as if it were hygiene. He believed that what he was doing was not evil but necessary. To him, compassion was weakness, mercy was betrayal. In 1943, he gave a chilling speech to SS officers in Poznan, speaking of the extermination of the Jewish people as a page of glory in our history that has never been written and never shall be. His audience applauded. It was the moment the mask slipped when ideology revealed its true face. Under Himmler's command, the SS and Gestapo executed the final solution, coordinating with Eichmann and Loescher to deport millions of Jews to death camps. Across occupied Europe, the trains ran on time. The records were kept in perfect order. In Himmler's world, even murder had a filing system. Yet, despite his absolute authority, Himmler was driven by contradictions. He preached racial purity, yet dabbled in mysticism. Obsessed with runes, astrology, and the occult, he fancied himself the high priest of a new Germanic religion, blending medieval myth with modern murder. He collected relics, ordered archaeological expeditions, and sought to rewrite history in the image of the SS. In his headquarters at Wilsberg Castle, he envisioned a future temple for his order, a sacred hall where SS leaders would gather after victory to rule over a new Aryan empire. It was delusion dressed as destiny, but it revealed the mind of the man, meticulous, fanatical, detached from reality, yet entirely convinced of his mission. As the war turned against Germany, Himmler's empire began to crumble. The Waffen-SS fought desperately on every front, while his concentration camps became death marches, moving victims westward as the Allies advanced. By 1945, the illusion of the Reich was gone. Himmler, ever the bureaucrat of survival, tried to negotiate peace with the Western Allies behind Hitler's back, offering to surrender German forces to save himself. When Hitler discovered the betrayal, he stripped Himmler of all titles and expelled him from the party. The man who had once controlled life and death across Europe was now a fugitive, wandering through the wreckage of the world he had built. In May 1945, disguised as a common soldier, Himmler was captured by British forces near Bremen. He gave a false name, but his identity was soon uncovered. When the interrogators searched him, they found the truth in his papers, and when they told him he would face trial, he and Heinrich Himmler did what he had always done. He chose control over consequence. He bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule and died instantly. The man who had built the most terrifying system of control in modern history died by his own hand, escaping the judgment he had denied to millions. And yet, Himmler's shadow remains. His legacy is not just the ruins of the Reich or the ashes of its victims, but the lesson he left behind that evil does not always wear the face of a monster. Sometimes it wears glasses, speaks softly, and files reports in perfect order. Himmler's genius was not in brutality, but in systematizing it, turning ideology into industry, and obedience into genocide. Tonight, we step into that shadow, into the mind, the machinery, and the myth of the man who built the SS and commanded the Gestapo. This is the entire history of Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Waffen-SS, the master of the Gestapo, and the quiet destroyer who turned a nation's fear into his empire. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you tonight? Heinrich Himmler was born in Munich in 1900 in a home that valued tradition and discipline. His father was a strict schoolmaster, carrying himself with the dignity of an old-world educator. His mother was gentle but distant, teaching him order through quiet routine rather than tender affection. The boy was frail in body, often sickly, and he struggled to match the vigor of other children his age. His health left him with a sense of inadequacy, a longing to prove his worth through something other than strength. From early on, he gravitated to books and stories, finding in them a world where weakness could be hidden beneath knowledge. He filled notebooks with careful handwriting, recording facts with the precision of a student who longed to master everything. Even as a child, he displayed a fascination with rules, rituals, and hierarchy, as if they offered him protection from uncertainty. The quietness of his childhood gave him time to shape dreams of who he might one day become. And in that quietness, the search for belonging began to guide him forward. Munich, the city of his birth, was filled with the weight of German history. Its churches, streets, and monuments whispered stories of a noble past that seemed distant yet powerful. Young Heinrich walked through its neighborhoods with watchful eyes, drawn not to the noise of crowds, but to the solidity of stone walls and the order of marching bands. He loved the ceremonial quality of parades, the neat lines of uniforms, and the sound of songs sung in unison. These impressions gave him a sense of harmony, where every figure had a place, every note had a purpose. He admired the idea that chaos could be tamed by rhythm and authority. For a boy who often felt weak, this order carried a strange promise of strength. In school, he was not the loudest voice or the brightest presence, but he was the one who studied rules until they became second nature. That devotion to order would become the foundation of his life's direction. The young boy's admiration for structure carried him quietly from childhood into adolescence. His family life revolved around tradition, meals taken at fixed hours, and prayers said with steady rhythm. His father's profession as a teacher instilled an atmosphere of discipline in their home, where the authority of learning carried great weight. Heinrich respected his father deeply, though he often felt overshadowed by expectations he could never fully meet. He was not a natural athlete, and the games that delighted other boys only deepened his awareness of weakness. Instead, he retreated to his desk where maps, histories, and stories of knights became his companions. He admired tales of medieval orders, men bound together by vows of loyalty and faith. These stories gave him comfort, for they suggested that courage did not always depend on physical power, but could be found in service to something higher. His family's quiet routines reinforced his desire for stability, where each day had its rightful shape, and within these walls, the boy began to form his peculiar vision of belonging. Thus, his childhood home became both his refuge and his forge. As he grew into his teenage years, Himmler's curiosity stretched into the larger questions of identity and heritage. He wondered what it meant to be German, and how one could serve a nation that had once seemed so great. He devoured myths of ancient tonic warriors, noble in their simplicity, unbroken in their faith. He admired the notion that bloodlines carried destiny, and that one's roots connected them to a deeper history. For him, these stories softened the reality of his own frailty, for they promised that strength could be inherited through spirit, even if not through the body. In the classroom he remained diligent, never dazzling, but always steady, never questioning authority. Teachers noted his obedience and his detail, though rarely his brilliance. Yet obedience was for Heinrich a quiet form of power. He did not yet know how far it would carry him, but he felt its silent weight growing. And in that sense of growth, a path was already beginning to unfold before him. The world outside his home was changing, though, and young Heinrich felt it pressing against him. Germany was shifting, struggling with modernity, and with the strains of a society that no longer seemed entirely stable. The echoes of the old order were fading, yet the longing for it still filled many households. Heinrich absorbed this longing like the air he breathed, finding comfort in traditions. Even as the world around him grew restless, his health remained delicate, and his inwardness only deepened, setting him apart from more robust companions. But separation did not trouble him, as it might others. Instead, it gave him the freedom to dream in private, his notebooks filled with details of German kings, military ranks, and even farm records. As if he were preparing for a role not yet defined, he began to think that belonging came not through force, but through service to something larger. The boy, who could not lift a sword, could still hold a pen that carried authority, and slowly this realization carried him further into his own imagination. When adolescence brought uncertainty, Himmler sought refuge in the strict order of religion and ritual. Catholicism, in his household, gave him a framework of prayer symbols and sacred order. He studied the prayers with the same care he gave to history books, memorizing not only words but their patterns of repetition. Yet even in this devotion he was restless, searching for something that seemed missing in the teachings he heard. He longed for a belief that bound not just spirit but body, land, and people together. In German legends, he found echoes of these myths that suggested a harmony between nature and blood. His mind blended these impressions into a private world where knights and farmers shared one destiny. To a boy seeking wholeness, this was deeply soothing, a dream of life where nothing was out of place. Such dreams gave him a quiet sense of mission, even if it was not yet clear what that mission would be. And so he carried this sense forward into the uncertain years to come. In the years before adulthood, Himmler became fascinated with military life, though only as an observer. He studied uniforms, insignias, and ranks with the meticulous interest of a collector. While others admired battles or victories, Heinrich admired the symbols of order, the way a patch or a medal could tell a story of duty. He drew charts of armies, memorized dates of campaigns, and quietly imagined himself among their ranks. He felt no shame in not fighting, for he believed that service could take many forms. His health might never allow him to be the hero on the battlefield, but perhaps he could be the one who preserved the spirit behind it. This conviction gave him a strange confidence, as though fate had prepared another kind of path for him. In his solitude, he rehearsed the idea of serving through organization and knowledge, and this thought, gentle but persistent, shaped the direction of his ambitions. Thus, a boy's fascination slowly matured into the beginnings of a man's purpose. As Germany moved into the First World War, Heinrich was still too young to join. Yet he followed every development with unwavering attention, keeping diaries filled with notes and dates. He admired soldiers as figures of discipline, though he never experienced the mud or terror of the trenches. In this distance, war became, for him, an almost romantic ideal, cleansed of its true horror. He imagined service not as bloodshed, but as an act of devotion where sacrifice gave life meaning. This filtered vision of conflict became one of his strongest impressions, shaping how he would later view loyalty and duty. While others returned broken, Heinrich remained untouched, left only with his untested fantasies. His longing for a role grew sharper, as though history itself had passed him by. But rather than despair, he turned this longing inward, making plans for how he might one day serve. And with that inward turn, his story began to take on a quieter, darker momentum. By the time Himmler entered adulthood, the fragile boy had become a young man, still searching for belonging. He was not remarkable to those around him, yet within himself he carried a world of order, duty, and myth. The longing for structure remained his constant companion, as steady as breath. The German defeat in 1918 would soon give that longing a new and dangerous direction, one that would call to him with irresistible force. But in these early years he was still simply Heinrich, a quiet student with careful handwriting and an obedient heart. His mind, however, was already woven with the threads of myth and history that would later define him. He did not yet know how deeply his search for order would entwine with the destiny of his nation. He was only a man waiting to belong, waiting to serve, waiting to find his role. And in that waiting, the calm of his beginning gave way to the rising tension of the years to come. The First World War ended with silence for Heinrich Himmler, not with the sound of shells, but with the weight of defeat felt in every German home. He had been too young to serve, too frail to march, and so the war remained for him a dream half-lived, admired from the safety of distance. Yet the outcome pierced him all the same, for the surrender of 1918 carried humiliation that soaked into the walls of his country. He listened to veterans who returned bitter, broken, and uncertain, their uniforms tattered, their faces lined with unspoken grief. They had gone to fight with faith in the empire, but they returned to a republic that many did not understand. Heinrich, still young and restless, absorbed their words with quiet intensity, storing away the sting of their disappointment. He wondered why destiny had chosen to leave him behind, untouched yet unsatisfied, and why others had carried the burden of sacrifice in his place. The Treaty of Versailles became for him more than a political arrangement. It was a symbol of loss and weakness that demanded some answer, and in that sense of unfinished duty, his heart turned more intently toward the promise of order he still longed to find. Munich in those years was a city of tension filled with hunger, unrest, and shadows of protest. The old empire was gone, and the new republic seemed fragile, unsteady, undoubted by many of its citizens. Young Himmler walked its streets with cautious steps, noticing the anger in the air and the posters that promised renewal. He saw former soldiers gather in groups, wearing the marks of their service with pride, even as their country faltered. Secret meetings whispered of betrayal, of enemies both within and without, and of the need for strength to be restored. He listened closely to these voices, not as a leader, but as a quiet student of discontent. He was drawn to their sense of unity, their symbols, and their certainty in a time of confusion. For a boy who loved order, this defiance against chaos seemed like a path toward belonging. He did not yet know where it would lead, only that the fragments of broken Germany offered him the beginnings of purpose, and with each passing day, the stillness of childhood gave way to the unease of restless youth. Books became his constant refuge in this unsettled time, for they carried not only knowledge, but visions of what might be possible. He read histories of Germany's greatness, tracing the rise and fall of emperors and kings. He studied accounts of war, imagining himself not as a soldier of the trenches, but as a man guiding forces through strategy and will. More dangerously, he began to devour writings that fed the bitterness spreading in his society. Anti-Semitic tracts, racial theories, and pamphlets of nationalist groups fell into his hands, offering explanations that seemed simple to a restless mind. These ideas gave his frustrations a language, a story of why Germany had fallen, and who must be blamed. Though presented as truth, they were filled with prejudice and poison. Yet to Heinrich they sounded like clarity, his notebooks filled with careful notes, as if he were a scholar assembling a worldview out of fragments of resentment. This quiet study marked the beginning of a certainty that would shape his life, and in that growing certainty, the boy who sought order began to find it in darker forms. The world of paramilitary groups fascinated him, though he did not belong fully to their ranks. After the war, men gathered in uniforms once more, forming Freikorps units that promised discipline and strength amid the Republic's weakness. Heinrich admired them from a distance, their order and pride filling the space that had been left empty by the empire's collapse. Their banners, marches, and songs echoed the medieval traditions he had once loved, now brought into the present with sharp edges. To him they seemed like living proof that Germany's spirit had not been lost, only waiting to be revived. He did not wield their weapons or stand in their lines, but he carried their ideals within himself like a secret oath. For a young man longing to belong, this world of discipline and unity seemed to offer a quiet promise. He remained the observer, the one who studied symbols and systems rather than led with voice or fist. But through observation he absorbed the shape of loyalty, that would later define him. And with each uniform he saw, the dream of structure grew stronger within him. At university, Heinrich tried to shape himself into a man of learning. Studying agriculture with the precision of a careful student, farming seemed simple and pure to him, a life tied to the soil, to discipline and to order. He believed that Germany's renewal might be found not in the factories or the cities, but in the quiet strength of its countryside. This belief blended with the myths he had carried from childhood, where land and blood were bound together. He studied farm yields and breeding techniques with the same passion he had once given to history books. Science gave him tools, while ideology gave him direction, and together they formed a vision of Germany reborn through its fields. His professors may not have seen brilliance in him, but they noticed his steadiness, his obsession with detail, his devotion to process. To Heinrich, every lesson was more than knowledge. It was another piece in the puzzle of how order could be restored. He looked at farms not only as land, but as symbols of stability, and in that vision he found a quiet anchor amid the storms of political upheaval. The humiliation of defeat, however, never left him, and it shaped how he viewed the world beyond the classroom. The Republic seemed weak to him, too divided, too uncertain, unable to satisfy the hunger for dignity that stirred in his heart. He felt that the old Germany with its discipline and unity must be restored in some new form. Friends and acquaintances introduced him to meetings where nationalist groups gathered, where speakers promised strength and purity. These voices fed the thoughts already forming in his mind, convincing him that order could only come through decisive change. He admired their conviction. Even if he remained a quiet presence among them, his mind worked not in bursts of passion, but in slow accumulations, layer by layer, until belief became unshakable. What began as a longing for order was turning into an ideological certainty. And as these thoughts settled in, Heinrich Himmler's path grew ever more aligned with forces rising in the shadows of his time. In his diary, he recorded his impressions with the care of a man preserving not only memory, but conviction. He wrote about politics, about religion, about the future he imagined for Germany, filling pages with reflections that gave shape to his inner world. His tone was often restrained, never fiery, yet behind it lay an intensity of belief that deepened with each passing year. He did not see himself as a man of violence, but as one who could guide others through clarity and purpose, even in private. He returned again and again to the themes of loyalty, discipline, and purity. For him, these words were not abstractions, but promises, answers to the chaos that surrounded him. His notes reveal a man who was not brilliant, not gifted with charisma, yet steadfast in conviction. He seemed to believe that his devotion to order itself would carve out a role for him, and in this devotion he found a steady calm that gave him purpose. Slowly, the fragile boy of childhood was transforming into a young man certain of his path. By the early 1920s, Heinrich Himmler had gathered within himself the fragments of identity that would soon align with the rising tide of the Nazi movement. He was not yet the figure of authority he would later become, but he was prepared quietly for the moment to come. His experiences of defeat, his fascination with order, his absorption of prejudice, and his devotion to discipline had formed the foundation of his worldview. The calm student of agriculture was beneath the surface, already shaping himself into something more dangerous. He still walked softly, still observed rather than commanded, yet his inner world burned with a growing sense of certainty. Germany's political storms were rising, and he felt drawn toward their energy like a moth to flame. He did not yet know the role he would play, but he believed with quiet conviction that destiny was waiting, and so the young man, who once sought only order in books and symbols, stepped slowly toward the movements that promised him belonging. Thus, the calm of the post-war years gave way to a rising current that would carry him into history. The early 1920s in Germany were restless years filled with turmoil and searching. Heinrich Himmler, still a student of agriculture, found himself drawn into the whirlpool of new political groups rising from the ruins of defeat. Among them, the National Socialist German Workers' Party grew rapidly, feeding on anger, resentment, and promises of renewal. At first, Himmler was only a quiet participant, attending gatherings with curiosity more than certainty. Yet, as he listened to speeches and read pamphlets, he felt their words echoing what had long been stirring in his own mind. The vision of unity, the demand for purity, and the devotion to discipline all spoke to him with quiet insistence. He was not yet a leader, nor even a prominent follower, but he sensed that here was a place where his longing for order might take root. In the ranks of this new movement, he saw men bound together, not by accident, but by belief. And in that shared belief, he recognized the beginnings of belonging. So his steps carried him gently, almost inevitably, into the folds of the party. At first his role was small, more an observer than a voice. Yet even this suited him well. Himmler was never the man to shout above a crowd, never the fiery orator who swayed masses with passion. He preferred the quiet strength of loyalty, the calm assurance of rules and structure. Within the party, he found others who valued obedience and discipline, and he was content to stand among them. He watched carefully how the leaders moved, how they spoke, how they demanded loyalty, and created ritual. These patterns reminded him of the myths and orders of knights he had admired since childhood. He sensed that the party was more than politics. It was becoming a kind of faith, binding its members through shared symbols and repeated vows. Himmler felt at home in this atmosphere of ritual where gestures carried meaning, and belonging was sealed with words. He was no longer just a student of agriculture, but a novice in a movement that promised destiny. And quietly he began to see a future forming before him. The years of inflation and despair only deepened his attachment to this rising cause. Ordinary Germans struggled to buy bread, their savings vanishing overnight, their lives reduced to uncertainty. In the midst of such chaos, the party's promises of strength, unity, and renewal felt steady and reassuring. Himmler, with his lifelong hunger for order, absorbed this message like nourishment. He saw in its structure the possibility of restoring what had been lost, of building something stronger than the fragile republic. As the swastika banners appeared more frequently, he recognized in them not just a political symbol, but a mark of belonging. It was a new kind of heraldry, one that carried both modern force and ancient resonance. The discipline of its gatherings, the rhythm of its chants, the order of its uniforms, spoke directly to his sense of beauty. For him, these things were not decoration but destiny, the shaping of chaos into a pattern he had always longed to see, and in their presence he felt the stirrings of a path he could finally walk with conviction. It was in this atmosphere that Himmler encountered the small, almost unnoticed formation, known as the Schutzstaffel or SS. At the time it was merely a guard unit, a handful of men assigned to protect party leaders. Few imagined it would one day grow into one of the most feared organizations in the world. But Himmler saw more than most. He recognized in this small band a potential that reached beyond mere security. Their black uniforms, their oaths of loyalty, their strict devotion to discipline, all echoed the chivalric orders he had admired in books. To him, the SS was not just a guard. It was the beginning of a new knightly order for a modern age. He watched their rituals with fascination, seeing in them the seeds of a community bound by faith rather than convenience. And in his heart, he felt a quiet certainty that here lay his true path. Thus a minor formation became for him the symbol of destiny. Himmler did not immediately rise to command, but he devoted himself to this unit with tireless dedication. He studied its structure, memorized its rules, and imagined ways it could grow into something greater. While others might have dismissed it as insignificant, he treated it with reverence, as if it were already a force of history. His fascination was not with power for its own sake, but with the promise of loyalty shaped into ritual. He dreamed of transforming these few men into an order that would embody discipline, purity, and faith in the future of Germany. In this dream, he saw not mere soldiers, but guardians of an ideal, chosen men who would live and die as symbols of order, To a mind that had always longed for certainty, the SS offered a canvas upon which he could draw his vision. Though his voice was still quiet, his ambition was beginning to grow. And through this devotion, he moved ever closer to the role he would one day claim. The party itself was still uncertain, subject to failures, crises, and ridicule in those early years. The failed beer hole patch of 1923 nearly destroyed it, scattering its followers and sending its leaders into prison. But even in setback, Himmler saw resilience. He remained loyal, continuing his studies, while keeping faith in the movement's eventual rise. For him, patience was not weakness, but a discipline. And he believed that time itself would vindicate their cause. He took no part in violence, but he absorbed its lessons with quiet attention, learning that order could grow even out of failure. The temporary collapse of the party only deepened his conviction that destiny required endurance. He noted how symbols, loyalty, and myth could survive even when practical politics faltered. And in this endurance, he found a model for the future role he dreamed of shaping. Thus, even failure became for him a lesson in the strength of faith and ritual. As the movement regained strength, Himmler became more firmly attached, no longer drifting on its edges, but weaving himself into its fabric. He took on small responsibilities, performing tasks with care, earning trust, not through charisma, but through reliability. His devotion made him stand out in a party where many came and went with the shifting tides of fortune. Those who knew him remarked on his diligence, his obsession with detail, and his quiet belief that loyalty itself was the highest virtue. In every oath, every uniform, every word of discipline, he saw not formality, but sacred duty. It was this mindset that separated him from countless others who passed through the party's ranks. For Himmler, nothing was trivial. Every gesture carried meaning. Every ritual reinforced belonging. His faith was not in speeches or leaders alone, but in the structures of loyalty that bound men together. This was the beginning of the bond that would one day give him immense power. And from this bond, his destiny drew steadily nearer. By the mid-1920s, Heinrich Himmler had transformed from a restless student into a committed member of the Nazi cause. His eyes were fixed on the SS, a formation still small and overlooked, but to him radiant with possibility. He felt that in its black flag, its oath of loyalty, and its devotion to order lay the seeds of something timeless. Though still young and minor in the party, he had found a place where his longing for structure and belonging could at last unfold. What had begun as quiet curiosity had become dedication, and dedication was turning into vision. The man who once sought meaning in myths and books was now weaving those same myths into living ritual. His belief in loyalty and purity, once abstract, was now finding its shape in uniforms and oaths. For Himmler, the path was no longer uncertain. It stretched ahead with quiet inevitability, and in following it, he was stepping closer to the moment when order and power would become his to command. When Himmler assumed leadership of the SS in 1929, it was still a small and overlooked formation, numbering only a few hundred men. Many within the party still regarded it as a mere bodyguard, secondary to the larger and more aggressive Tsar. But Himmler did not see weakness in smallness. He saw potential in purity and discipline. To him, the SS could be more than a guard, more than a uniformed presence at rallies. It could become a chosen order, an elite bound not by size, but by loyalty, myth, and faith. He believed that greatness was not born of numbers, but of spirit shaped into ritual. Quietly, patiently, he set about reshaping the unit in his own image. What others ignored, he cultivated, giving structure to something fragile and overlooked. And in this cultivation, he began the work of building not an army but an order. His vision was steeped in history, yet pointed toward the future. Himmler admired the medieval knights, sworn to obedience, living by codes that demanded loyalty beyond self. He saw in them a model for the SS, a fraternity that combined soldierly duty with spiritual devotion. Yet he did not merely copy the past, he fused it with modern ideology. Race and purity became central, woven into the oath that every SS man would take. To Himmler, this was not rhetoric, but destiny. For he believed that only the purest could guard the future of Germany. He demanded that every member prove his ancestry, tracing family lines back generations. He required a standard of discipline that extended beyond the battlefield into personal life. It was not enough to wear the uniform. One had to embody the myth it represented. And through this fusion of old ideals and new beliefs, Himmler began to give the SS its shape. Discipline was the heart of his creation. He was not a general leading charges, nor a fiery speaker rousing crowds, but an organizer who lived in detail. Himmler inspected not only training, but habits, appearance, and daily conduct. Every gesture, every word, every ritual was meant to remind the SS man of who he was and what he represented. Himmler insisted that the uniform be immaculate, the bearing upright, the salute precise. These outward forms carried inner meaning, reinforcing the sense of belonging to something larger. He believed that the smallest details created the strongest bonds, and so he cultivated them with relentless care. To others this might have seemed excessive, but to him it was sacred. Through repetition and ritual, discipline became a living faith, and with this faith, the SS slowly became something greater than its modest beginnings. Myth surrounded the order as much as rule and regulation. Himmler encouraged his men to think of themselves as guardians of a destiny, heirs to ancient traditions now reborn. He spoke of Germanic ancestors, of sacred bloodlines, of timeless duty. To outsiders, these ideas may have sounded strange, but within the SS, they created a sense of purpose that ordinary politics could never give. Members came to believe they were chosen, set apart from the rest, entrusted with guarding not just leaders, but the future of a nation. Symbols and ceremonies deepened this sense from the black flag to the solemn oaths, sworn by torchlight. Rituals transformed men into brothers, weaving myth into daily service. Himmler understood that men needed stories as much as orders, and he gave them both. He saw the SS not simply as soldiers, but as keepers of a legend, and through that legend, loyalty grew into devotion. This loyalty was not to Himmler alone, but to the ideal he embodied. He often described himself not as a master, but as a steward, one who served the order as much as it served him. Yet his quiet charisma lay in his ability to bind men through rules that gave them meaning. He offered structure where life had been uncertain, certainty where the world had been fractured. The men who entered the SS found not only comradeship, but a way of life complete in ritual and discipline. Himmler, meticulous and reserved, built a bond that was deeper than commands. He fostered a loyalty that was not based on fear alone, but on shared belief. This gave the SS a unity that could withstand hardship and doubt. It was in his mind a brotherhood of the faithful, and in that brotherhood he found the instrument of his own rise. The black uniform itself became a symbol of this transformation. It was stark, severe, and unmistakable, carrying with it an aura of mystery and power. Himmler ensured that the design carried echoes of both modern authority and ancient order. When an SS man walked in black, he carried more than cloth. He carried the weight of belonging. The uniform was a constant reminder that he was no longer an individual, but part of a chosen order. Himmler understood the psychology of symbols, how colors, patterns, and insignia could shape thought and behavior. He made the uniform a second skin, binding men to the image they projected. The black flag raised above them became a banner of loyalty, purity, and myth. Through such symbols, the SS was given an identity that words alone could never create. And in this identity, Himmler's vision began to take lasting form. What Himmler built was not an army of numbers, but an order of chosen men. He required each to be tested, each to prove his worth, each to live by rules that extended beyond the barracks. This exclusivity gave the SS a sense of pride that deepened its devotion. Members knew they were different, and difference bred loyalty. To belong was not easy, and difficulty made belonging all the more valued. Himmler's genius lay not in force of personality, but in force of organization. He created rules that gave meaning, rituals that gave identity, and symbols that gave pride. Out of small beginnings, he forged a core that was both military and mystical, and through this creation, he established himself as the architect of loyalty. By the early 1930s, the SS had grown from insignificance into a rising force within the Nazi movement. Himmler's careful hand had transformed it into a disciplined, loyal, and exclusive order. Its black flags, its symbols, its rituals, all carried the mark of his vision. The man once overlooked, as quiet and minor, had found his instrument, and through it his destiny. The SS was still young, still in the shadows of larger forces, but its foundation was now firm. It would soon become the steel framework upon which a regime could be built. Himmler himself was no longer simply a follower, but a maker of structures that endured. His path of discipline and myth had led him to power not through noise, but through silence shaped into strength. The architect of loyalty had built his order of knights, and the story of his rise was only beginning to unfold. By the early 1930s, Heinrich Himmler had grown from an organizer of a small order into a rising figure. Within the Nazi movement, his influence extended beyond the SS into the growing apparatus of state power, where opportunity waited quietly for the careful hand. The police, once a dispersed and unremarkable institution, became a tool he could mold with the same precision he had applied to the SS. Himmler approached this task with patience, observing procedures, hierarchies, and routines before making subtle changes. He valued paperwork as much as presence, believing that authority could flow as steadily from documents as from voices. His office became a quiet hub where forms, reports, and memos carried as much weight as any paid. Orders were given not with shouting but with pens, signatures, and the soft authority of certainty. Men responded to him because the structures he built gave clarity and consequence to their actions. The calm of administration masked the force behind it, and in this system, Himmler learned that control could be silent yet absolute. The Gestapo, newly formed and still mysterious to many, became the central instrument of his reach. Himmler understood that terror, when blended with bureaucracy, created a force far more effective than brute strength alone. He studied reports, memoranda, and lists with meticulous attention, tracing patterns of compliance, dissent, and suspicion. Each piece of paper, each entry carried meaning, allowing him to see the undercurrents of society without ever raising his voice. Men and women guided by rules and rituals unwittingly contributed to the network of observation and control. Himmler's genius lay in his patience, in seeing that a quiet, disciplined structure could enforce obedience more subtly than any speech or show of force. Through the careful layering of commands and hierarchies, he made the invisible visible and the uncertain certain. The boundaries between the SS, the police, and the Gestapo blurred under his guidance, forming a seamless web of influence. Each connection strengthened the whole, creating a system that moved with quiet inevitability. And through this weaving, Himmler's authority grew in ways both subtle and profound. He approached his work as an architect might approach a city, imagining connections, pathways, and patterns invisible to others. Every officer, every deputy, every club became a part of the structure he envisioned. Nothing was left to chance, and small inefficiencies were corrected with gentle but firm insistence. Himmler demanded precision in all things, and those who served him found that even the smallest details carried weight. Meetings were formal, reports exact, and protocols repeated until they became instinctive. This calm, methodical approach inspired both loyalty and awe in those who worked beneath him. He did not rely on personal magnetism to command, but on the certainty of the system itself. Men learned to respect not just him, but the order he maintained, and through that respect his influence grew quietly, but inexorably. The web he spun was invisible to most, yet it bound more tightly than any visible chain, and in its strength, Himmler discovered the power of quiet authority. He also understood the importance of loyalty beyond the surface. He selected men not only for competence, but for obedience, for belief in the ideals he embodied. The careful cultivation of devoted followers allowed him to extend his reach farther than he could manage alone. Within the hierarchy, each position, each role, each function was designed to reinforce order and allegiance. Himmler's vision was comprehensive, encompassing not only operations, but symbols, rituals, and codes of conduct. He cultivated the sense that those who served in his network were part of something sacred, a mission larger than themselves. Trust once earned became a bond that linked individuals to the system, rather than to Himmler personally. Through this bond, the network grew self-reinforcing, requiring less intervention while extending further influence. In this quiet cultivation, he learned the subtle balance of power, structures, and people intertwined, and through the intertwining, the web of control became an extension of his own disciplined mind. Even as his reach expanded, Himmler remained methodical and restrained. He did not display fury, nor did he raise his voice to assert dominance. Authority in his hands was carried in the calm arrangement of rules, in the repetition of rituals, and in the precision of procedure. Reports that might overwhelm others became for him maps of compliance and dissent. He traced patterns in silence, understanding where influence might falter and where loyalty ran deepest. Those who served within the SS or police felt the weight of organization, more than the weight of a man. The system became the teacher, the guide, and the enforcer, moving quietly yet inexorably through the lives it touched. Himmler learned that control could be most powerful when it felt inevitable, when obedience flowed from understanding rather than fear alone. And in this lesson, he found a method that would define his approach for decades. Himmler's personal discipline mirrored the structure he created for others. He rose early, reviewed reports, and studied every detail with care, setting an example of constancy and patience. His life was measured, his routines exact, his thinking meticulous. Those who observed him closely remarked on the stillness he carried, a calm that could encompass both vast networks and minute details. This quiet constancy reassured his followers, for it suggested that their work was guided by a mind both firm and unflinching. Even in moments of uncertainty, the system moved forward, steady and deliberate. Himmler believed that order in oneself was inseparable from order in the world. The discipline of the man became the discipline of the system, and through the union of personal and institutional order, his control extended further than any command could reach. The blending of SS and Gestapo under Himmler's guidance created a seamless flow of authority, intelligence, enforcement, and loyalty intertwined into a single network that functioned with remarkable efficiency. Men moved through the hierarchy with purpose, guided by rules that left little room for doubt. The web extended outward, touching every corner where compliance or obedience mattered. Himmler understood that fear was most effective when quiet, when uncertainty lingered, and when rules carried weight without loud demonstration. He cultivated this delicate balance, knowing that an invisible hand often guides more effectively than a visible one. Those within the network rarely questioned its reach, for it seemed natural and inevitable. And as the strands of control spread, Himmler's power grew in both subtlety and magnitude. The quiet precision of administration became a force in its own right. By the mid-1930s, Himmler had transformed a patchwork of police and security into a disciplined network of influence. The SS and Gestapo now operated in tandem, their structures interlocking and reinforcing one another. Authority flowed through the web he had built, reaching far beyond any single man or office. Himmler's rise was not spectacular in public display, but it was profound in consequence. The calm measured hand he applied to bureaucracy became a force that few could resist or evade. Paperwork, protocols, and rituals moved with deliberate pace, guiding compliance and shaping loyalty. The quiet mastery of systems proved as effective as any battlefield strategy. And in the weaving of this web, Himmler discovered that the world could be ruled not by speeches or spectacle, but by order made absolute. This realization carried him forward to even greater responsibility. As he looked upon the structures he had created, Himmler understood the depth of his own influence. The SS and police network was no longer just an instrument of power. It was an extension of his mind and will. Loyalty and discipline flowed through every office, every officer, and every protocol, creating a subtle but unbreakable chain. Men acted not merely because they were commanded, but because the system itself shaped their choices. Himmler's authority had become quiet, yet irresistible, a rhythm that moved through the institutions of the state. The web of control he had spun was both vast and intimate, touching lives while remaining largely unseen. Through patience, calculation, and dedication, he had woven power into the very fabric of governance, and in this quiet mastery, he prepared to extend the reach of his influence even further. Thus the calm of administration revealed itself as the foundation for absolute authority. Leading softly into the next chapter of his rise, Himmler's mind was always drawn to order, but it was not satisfied with rules and uniforms alone. He sought meaning beyond bureaucracy, in myths, symbols, and hidden forces. Ancient Germanic history called to him, carrying the whispers of runes, pagan rites, and sacred lands. He believed that the soul of Germany could be restored through understanding the blood that flowed through its people. Farmers to him were not merely laborers, but living vessels of heritage, preserving the strength of the land in their hands and in their veins. He wandered the countryside, noting the rhythm of seasons, the toil of the fields, the quiet dignity of those who lived close to the soil. In these observations, he found both inspiration and confirmation of his theories about purity and destiny. Himmler's interest in archaeology and pre-Christian traditions fed this obsession. As if the past itself could speak through ritual, he was fascinated by artifacts, symbols, and the hidden stories that traced the lineage of his people. And in this fascination, he began to weave a spiritual framework that would shape his vision of Germany. Runes became more than letters to him. They were a language of power, a bridge between past and present. Each mark carved into stone or wood seemed to hold a lesson, a warning, or a promise. He saw in them the order of the universe, a structure that could guide human behavior as surely as law and discipline. These symbols, when combined with ritual and belief, carried authority that words alone could never achieve. Himmler encouraged his SS men to learn their shapes and meanings, embedding them into ceremonies and insignia. He believed that the use of runes reinforced loyalty and purity, linking the individual to a larger cosmic order. His fascination with the occult was quiet and obsessive, never flamboyant, but it permeated every decision he made. For him, mysticism and administration were not separate. They were two currents flowing toward the same goal. And in these symbols he saw the reflection of destiny itself waiting to be fulfilled. The German peasantry held a special place in his mind, a living archive of ancestry and resilience. Himmler traveled to remote villages noting traditions, bloodlines, and the quiet endurance of rural life. He idealized the simplicity and self-sufficiency of these communities, believing they carried the essence of the Aryan past. To him, the farmer's connection to land was sacred, an unbroken chain linking generations. He imagined that by studying and preserving these ties, the nation could be strengthened from its roots upward. Himmler was captivated by the rhythm of planting and harvest, by the seasonal rituals that had endured for centuries. He saw the farmer's strength as both literal and symbolic, a model of endurance, loyalty, and purity. In his mind, the land itself was a teacher, revealing truths that could be read only by those willing to observe. His fascination was not sentimental. It was calculated, ideological, and spiritual all at once. And through it, he reinforced the sacred narrative that guided his worldview. Mysticism and racial ideology became inseparable in Himmler's thought. He believed that the strength of Germany depended not only on discipline and loyalty, but on the preservation of a pure bloodline. This conviction shaped the SS as much as any regulations or oaths. He envisioned a nation guided by the principles of ancestry, ritual, and sacred duty, where each individual's place was determined by heritage and faith. The past was not merely remembered, it was invoked, woven into ceremonies, uniforms, and hierarchy. Himmler's fascination with occult ideas offered a moral cloak to his vision, transforming abstract ideas of obedience into spiritual responsibility. Men who followed him felt themselves part of something eternal, a continuity that stretched from distant ancestors to a promised future. Even the simplest gestures, when framed in ritual, became acts of devotion, and through this devotion, the ideology of purity became tangible, a quiet force that guided behavior. He extended this philosophy into the training and selection of SS members. Prospective recruits were carefully screened, not only for loyalty and discipline, but for ancestry, health, and perceived spiritual alignment. Himmler believed that blood carried traits beyond the physical, an invisible inheritance of character and destiny. The rituals of induction were solemn, designed to instill a sense of sacred purpose. Every oath, every inspection, every ceremony was infused with layers of meaning that tied the individual to an ideal larger than himself. In this way, obedience and belief were fused, each reinforcing the other. Himmler's attention to detail in these matters was exhaustive, yet never ostentatious, reflecting the quiet intensity of his mind. He believed that the cultivation of purity required constant care, vigilance, and ritualized action, and in the careful shaping of men, he believed he could shape the future of the nation itself. The fusion of mysticism, ideology, and administration gave Himmler a sense of destiny. He was not a man of impulsive displays or fiery rhetoric. His power came from the quiet certainty of his beliefs. Each act, each order, each ceremony reinforced a worldview that made obedience feel natural. The world in his vision moved according to hidden laws, both spiritual and hereditary. Himmler believed he could discern these laws, guiding the nation along paths preordained by blood and land. His fascination with the occult provided both comfort and justification, turning abstract ideology into cosmic purpose. Even difficult decisions were framed as alignment with destiny, rather than personal preference or ambition. In this sense, morality and strategy intertwined in ways only he could perceive, and through this lens, every action seemed not only necessary, but inevitable. Himmler's quiet obsession also shaped his personal life, influencing habits, diet, and daily routines. He avoided indulgence, seeking discipline in every corner of existence. His reading ranged from medieval texts to obscure manuscripts on Germanic mythology and mystical traditions. He collected artifacts, symbols, and documents, assembling a private world that mirrored the spiritual order he sought to instill in others. The mind of Himmler was always active, ranging, correlating, and imagining, blending fact and myth into a coherent philosophy. His fascination was meticulous, almost reverent, as if studying these truths could unlock the destiny of a people. Every encounter, every visit to a village, every ritual observed was an opportunity to learn, confirm, or refine his understanding. And in this continuous quiet work, he deepened both knowledge and belief. The spiritual dimension became inseparable from the administrative, forming the foundation for his growing authority. By the late 1930s, Himmler's faith in blood and soil had become central to his vision of the SS and Germany. He had transformed mystical and racial ideas into guiding principles that directed both men and institutions. The land, the past, and the lineage of its people were intertwined in a sacred mission. Men in black, bound by oaths and rituals, carried the weight of this philosophy into daily life, seeing their service as part of destiny itself. Himmler moved through this world with calm intensity, ensuring that every rule, ceremony, and inspection reinforced the narrative. The mystical cloak he had woven over his work gave meaning to acts that might otherwise have been seen as mundane or administrative. Through belief, discipline, and ritual, he shaped obedience into devotion. And in this devotion, Himmler found the quiet power that would carry him toward the next stage of his rise. Thus, the calm of ideology began to swell into a rising force. Leading softly into the wider world he sought to shape. By the late 1930s, Himmler's vision had begun to take shape far beyond the confines of the SS barracks. He understood that true power required more than soldiers. It required a self-sustaining ecosystem, a society built upon loyalty, discipline, and ideology. The SS expanded quietly, acquiring businesses, farms, and settlements that created both wealth and influence. Himmler oversaw this growth with the same meticulous care he had applied to training and ritual. Every acquisition, every enterprise was carefully calculated to reinforce the authority of the order. Men who had sworn loyalty to the SS now lived, worked, and invested in its structures. Blurring the lines between organization and community, villages were transformed into enclaves of discipline and ideology, where daily life reflected the values Himmler held dear. Industry and agriculture became extensions of the SS, linking economic activity with identity and purpose. Through these subtle yet deliberate expansions, the SS became more than a corps of soldiers. It became a society in miniature, and in this quiet transformation, Himmler's influence grew steadily, almost imperceptibly. He approached this growth as he had approached discipline, with patience and foresight. Himmler studied each region, each enterprise, assessing its potential to strengthen the order without drawing undue attention. He preferred incremental changes, small shifts that compounded over time into lasting structures. Loyalty was cultivated through opportunity, with men rewarded not only for obedience, but for initiative that aligned with his vision. Families who joined SS settlements were drawn into networks of education, work, and ritual, forming communities bound by shared belief. Himmler saw these settlements as living embodiments of his ideology, microcosms of the future Germany he imagined. Even the layout of farms, offices, and residences reflected order, efficiency, and symbolism. The SS economy became a quiet engine, supporting expansion while reinforcing discipline. And through this careful nurturing, Himmler learned that growth could be subtle, almost invisible, yet profoundly effective. The power of patience revealed itself as a steady tide, shaping both men and institutions. Industry played a central role in this quiet empire. Himmler encouraged enterprises that aligned with the ideals of self-sufficiency, technical skill, and loyalty. Factories were staffed by men and women who had been carefully vetted for commitment, creating a workforce that embodied both competence and obedience. He studied production schedules, supply lines, and labor habits, treating each as a node in a larger network of influence. Even mundane details, tools, uniforms, and reporting structures were carefully controlled, ensuring conformity and efficiency. In this way, Himmler extended the SS's presence into daily life, turning work itself into a medium of loyalty. Industry became a classroom, a proving ground, and a symbol of belonging. The economic reach of the SS grew quietly, yet its influence became visible in every corner it touched. Himmler's vision was comprehensive, linking labor, ideology, and ritual into a seamless whole. And as the organization's wealth and stability expanded, so too did his authority over those who depended upon it. Agriculture too became a focus of influence and ideology. Himmler admired the discipline, continuity, and connection to land that farming required. SS settlements cultivated crops and livestock, not only for sustenance, but for symbolic meaning, reinforcing the bond between people, land, and ancestry. Young recruits were assigned to these communities, learning both the rhythms of the seasons and the lessons of heritage he valued so deeply. He believed that the connection to soil carried a moral and spiritual significance, rooting obedience and loyalty in tangible labor. Every act of cultivation was framed as a contribution to the future of the nation, embedding ideology into the rhythms of daily life. Himmler's attention to detail ensured that farms, schools, and workshops were integrated, creating cohesive communities that mirrored his vision of order. In this quiet structuring, even simple routines became lessons in discipline and purpose. And through these agricultural settlements, the SS extended its reach into regions that were once untouched. weaving influence into the very fabric of rural life. The SS also grew in prestige through ceremonial and symbolic acts. Himmler understood that the perception of power mattered as much as its practical application. Festivals, parades, and commemorations reinforced the ideology of loyalty, ancestry, and duty. Even minor observances were orchestrated to deepen commitment and convey meaning. Members of the order internalized these rituals, seeing themselves as part of a sacred mission. Himmler watched over these events with quiet intensity, ensuring that every gesture aligned with the greater vision. Symbols of heritage and destiny were woven into every action, linking the individual to the community to the order, and the order to Himmler's broader aims. The effect was cumulative, subtle, and profoundly shaping. Through these ceremonies, the SS became more than an organization. It became an identity, a lens through which life itself was interpreted. And in this process, Himmler's influence was no longer merely administrative, but deeply cultural and spiritual. Education and training reinforced this quiet expansion. Himmler believed that knowledge, like loyalty, could be structured and directed. Schools within SS settlements combined practical skills, ideological lessons, and physical discipline. Boys and girls learned not only trades, but also the myths, symbols, and values that define the SS world. Curriculum, ritual, and daily routine were tightly integrated, shaping minds and bodies alike. Teachers were carefully selected for competence and belief, becoming instruments of both knowledge and subtle indoctrination. Himmler saw these institutions as critical to the longevity of the order, ensuring that loyalty and ideology were passed to the next generation. Education became a thread that tied settlements together, creating a shared consciousness among men, women, and children. Through this weaving of knowledge, labor, and belief, the SS became a self-reinforcing society. And through these networks, Himmler's quiet expansion extended deeper and farther than any public display could reveal. Influencing government and administration complemented these practical expansions. Himmler positioned trusted men in civil offices, regional authorities, and local administrations. These appointments ensured that SS priorities were woven into the broader structures of power. Without overt disruption, policies, incentives, and oversight were carefully calibrated to reinforce obedience and alignment with his vision. The bureaucracy became an instrument of extension, spreading the order's reach into everyday governance. Himmler's understanding of organization allowed him to wield this influence without drawing attention to himself. Those within the system often acted out of habit, procedure, and loyalty, unaware of the subtle shaping occurring around them. The quiet spread of authority was nearly invisible to outsiders, yet profoundly felt by those within its orbit. And in this seamless integration of governance and order, the SS became not just a corps, but a society within society. By the end of the decade, Himmler's quiet expansion had created a self-sustaining empire of influence, loyalty, and ideology. Soldiers, workers, farmers, students, and administrators alike became threads in the fabric of his vision. The SS was no longer confined to uniforms and barracks. It existed in daily life, in labor, in education, in ritual, and in belief. Himmler's authority, once subtle and administrative, now carried weight across regions and institutions. Men and women moved through the structures he built, guided by rules, routines, and symbols that reinforced obedience. Power had shifted, flowing through systems as much as through command. The calm of organization had become the pulse of influence, and the quiet work of expansion ensured that the order could endure. And in this sustained and deliberate growth, Himmler prepared the foundation for the next stage of history, where the SS would not merely serve, but shape the world around it. Himmler's vision of the SS had always encompassed more than administration, ritual, and loyalty. He imagined a force capable of action, a silent army bound by ideology as much as duty. In the late 1930s, this vision took shape in the form of the weapon SS. a military arm parallel to the traditional German army. Unlike the regular forces, these soldiers were selected not only for skill and endurance, but for ideological commitment. Each man swore oaths not only to the Führer, but to the ideals Himmler embodied: ancestry, purity, and unwavering obedience. Training was exacting, combining rigorous physical discipline with lessons in history, myth, and ritual. The black uniforms carried weight even in the field, symbols of belonging and sacred duty. Himmler understood that obedience born of belief would endure, where obedience born of fear alone might falter. And in the quiet shaping of these soldiers, he forged a force that was as much spiritual as it was martial. The weapon SS became a laboratory of loyalty, a place where ideology and action merged seamlessly. And with its creation, Himmler stepped from administrator into the realm of military power. Each regiment, each battalion was structured with precision and purpose. Himmler insisted that command be absolute but rooted in the same sense of ritual and order that guided the SS at home. Soldiers learned to move as one, to anticipate, to obey, and to embody the ideals they had been taught since induction. The hierarchy was reinforced by ceremonies and symbols linking each man to his predecessors, and to the broader vision of the SS. Himmler watched over this development with patient intensity, valuing discipline, cohesion, and belief over flamboyant displays of strength. Training grounds became both classrooms and proving grounds, where men tested endurance, skill, and faith in quiet, exacting routines. Even the simplest drills carried meaning, reinforcing the sense that every act of service was part of a larger destiny. In these practices, loyalty became muscle memory and obedience a rhythm of life. Through this subtle cultivation, Himmler created a force that could operate independently yet remain inseparable from the order itself. And in this shaping, the SS gained the qualities of both soldier and believer. The Waffen-SS did not exist merely as an instrument of war. It was also an instrument of identity. Each recruit was enveloped in a narrative that linked personal action to history, ancestry, and duty. Men came to see themselves as part of something eternal, an order that transcended ordinary life. Even in moments of fatigue, drill, or challenge, the ideology woven into daily routines reinforced purpose and cohesion. Himmler believed that the soldier who understood his place in this larger order would endure both hardship and moral ambiguity. Bonds between men were strengthened by shared ritual, shared labor, and shared belief. Each insignia, each salute, each ceremonial act carried meaning beyond the immediate task. And as soldiers internalized these lessons, the Waffen-SS became more than an army. It became an extension of Himmler's vision of society, discipline, and destiny. Quietly, inexorably, the Shadow Army took shape, a living emblem of ideology made flesh. And with it the stage was set for their movement onto the wider continent. Himmler's attention to logistics and infrastructure was as meticulous as his focus on ritual. He ensured that supply lines, barracks, and communications were integrated with both efficiency and symbolism. Men were assigned to units and locations that reinforced loyalty and operational coherence. Even the layout of camps and training grounds reflected principles of order, hierarchy, and ritual. Through these careful arrangements, the Waffen-SS operated as a cohesive organism rather than a collection of individuals. Himmler believed that structure alone could instill confidence, control, and obedience. Every detail from paperwork to parade reinforced the ideological framework that bound the soldiers together. In this way, administration became a subtle weapon, shaping action before it began. And through this quiet, deliberate preparation, the SS Army gained the readiness and cohesion that would soon be tested on distant fields. Selection of officers was equally precise, combining competence with ideological alignment. Himmler understood that leadership carried the responsibility of transmitting both orders and belief. Commanders were expected not only to train and lead, but to embody the values that made the army unique. This created a culture where obedience was mirrored by conviction and authority by moral example. Decisions were filtered through discipline, belief, and careful planning, leaving little room for deviation or doubt. Officers were closely observed, evaluated, and mentored, ensuring continuity of both skill and ideology. The chain of command became a conduit for loyalty as much as for instruction, and in the quiet diligence of selection and oversight, Himmler ensured that the Shadow Army could move with confidence, precision, and unity. Each unit became a reflection of the broader vision, prepared for both action and adherence, and so the soldiers were ready not only in body, but in mind and spirit. The Waffen-SS also served as a proving ground for Himmler's ideas about society and community. Within the ranks, men were expected to live, train, and operate in harmony with the values of the order. Ritual, labor, and camaraderie intertwined, reinforcing a sense of purpose beyond individual ambition. Friendships were framed by shared duties and shared ideology, creating bonds that transcended circumstance. Himmler believed that this microcosm reflected the broader society he wished to shape, where duty, belief, and ancestry dictated both opportunity and loyalty. Discipline became a rhythm, ritual became a habit, and loyalty became identity. Each day, each task, each interaction carried subtle lessons in hierarchy, obedience, and belonging. The army, in this sense, was not only prepared for conflict, but for life, as the SS imagined it. And in this quiet integration of ideology and action, Himmler extended his vision beyond administration and into the lived experience of soldiers. The first deployments of the Waffen-SS marked a turning point in their identity and purpose. Though still under the shadow of the traditional army, these units moved with cohesion and confidence, guided by training, discipline, and belief. Soldiers carried the quiet weight of ideology into every maneuver, every camp, and every exercise. Himmler observed not from the front lines, but from the networks he had built, understanding that his influence traveled with them. The men were conscious of their uniqueness, and that consciousness shaped behavior, morale, and cohesion. Even the most routine operations were imbued with meaning, as though each step reinforced both order and destiny. Through this integration, the Waffen-SS became more than troops. They became living extensions of the SS, the embodiment of loyalty, ritual, and discipline. And as they prepared to move beyond Germany's borders, the Shadow Army quietly took its place in history's unfolding. By the end of the decade, the Waffen-SS had matured into a force both disciplined and devoted. Himmler's quiet hand had shaped soldiers who were bound as much by ideology as by duty. Their uniforms, training, rituals, and oaths carried the imprint of his vision, creating a unique and self-reinforcing culture. The army operated not merely under orders, but within a framework of belief where obedience was intertwined with purpose. Himmler's influence extended into every barracks, every training ground, and every deployment, a presence felt without display. The Shadow Army was ready to test both its cohesion and its ideals in the wider world. And in this readiness, the SS became not merely a military formation, but a reflection of the order, discipline, and quiet authority that Himmler had spent decades cultivating. Through this careful construction, the march into Europe was no longer a matter of chance. It was the deliberate unfolding of a vision. And as the first units crossed borders, the world would encounter not just soldiers, but the embodiment of a meticulously crafted ideology. The Gestapo, under Himmler's guidance, became the quiet engine of control that spread through the daily lives of the nation. Its strength was not in spectacle or show, but in observation, calculation, and structure. Whispers carried farther than speeches, and suspicion moved unseen through neighborhoods, offices, and towns. Himmler's genius lay in organizing these small, almost invisible currents into a web that could touch everyone without effort. Each report, each list, each memorandum contributed to a lattice of knowledge and authority. Men and women learned to act with caution, to measure words, and to guard thoughts, unaware that the system itself was shaping behavior. Officers of the Gestapo moved silently, guided by rules, procedure, and the invisible hand of Himmler's design. The calm efficiency of the organization amplified its reach far beyond what any display of force could achieve, and in the quiet of daily life, fear became routine, unspoken, yet pervasive. This was power exercised not with passion, but with precision. The bureaucracy behind the Gestapo was meticulous, deliberate, and nearly invisible to those outside it. Forms were filled, reports submitted, patterns noted, and connections traced, all under a system that valued accuracy above impulse. Himmler understood that terror could be sustained best when it appeared inevitable, when every action, every misstep, every rumor could be tracked and accounted for. Officers rarely needed to act with visible violence. The threat of observation was often sufficient. Men and women responded to unseen authority, their choices shaped as much by procedure as by fear. Even in its quiet administrative rhythm, the Gestapo's reach was extensive, touching families, workplaces, and communities. Himmler oversaw these networks with calm intensity, attending to detail and flow rather than spectacle. His focus was systemic rather than emotional, creating a machinery of control that functioned autonomously. And through this careful arrangement, obedience and caution became as natural as daily routine. The order itself, more than any individual, ensured compliance. Recruitment and training within the Gestapo reflected Himmler's broader philosophy. Men were selected for discipline, reliability, and willingness to follow rules without question. Their work was methodical, focused, and guided by manuals, regulations, and precedent. Officers were expected to anticipate patterns, trace connections, and act with quiet decisiveness when necessary. Daily tasks became a rhythm of observation, analysis, and reporting, shaping both behavior and mindset. Himmler emphasized mental acuity as much as loyalty, believing that the greatest power lay in understanding networks rather than displaying force. Fieldwork was accompanied by meticulous record-keeping, ensuring that knowledge accumulated with consistency and clarity. Each report, each arrest, each investigation added to the invisible architecture of influence he had built. And through these structures, the Gestapo functioned not as individuals, but as a cohesive system, extending the reach of authority into every corner. Himmler's approach to fear was both clinical and subtle. He avoided outbursts or displays of anger, preferring to let procedure and expectation guide compliance. Those under the watch of the Gestapo learned that deviation, no matter how small, could have consequences. Fear was not sudden or chaotic. It was calm, measured, and inescapable. Whispered names, unexpected visits, and sudden requests for reports carried the quiet weight of possibility. Officers were trained to act as extensions of the system, not as arbiters of passion or morality. In this way, terror became ambient, surrounding life like a quiet fog that touched every corner. Even routine interactions were colored by the invisible presence of authority. And in this subtle shaping, Himmler demonstrated the power of organization itself, revealing that control could be more profound than any display of force. Fear became normalized, a backdrop to daily existence rather than an extraordinary event. The Gestapo's influence extended into communities through networks of informants, surveillance, and careful observation. Neighbors, colleagues, and even distant acquaintances could become conduits of information, their reports feeding the machinery of authority. Himmler recognized that the effectiveness of the system depended as much on this quiet participation as on formal procedures. Men and women acted almost unconsciously, their behavior shaped by the knowledge that someone might always be watching. This participation made the system self-reinforcing, and obedience spread through social dynamics as effectively as through orders. Himmler's calm oversight ensured that these networks operated smoothly, minimizing disruption while maximizing reach. Patterns of behavior, loyalty, and compliance could be traced, assessed, and guided with almost imperceptible nudges. And in this silent orchestration, the Gestapo became a living web, subtle yet inescapable. The ordinary rhythms of life carried the weight of oversight, making the extraordinary appear ordinary. Even Himmler's own presence was rarely dramatic. He relied on the structure and processes he had built. Decisions flowed through memos, meetings, and chain of command, rather than declarations or commands. Officers learned to anticipate his expectations through training protocol and the study of precedent. Every arrest, every investigation, and every report was framed within the system, reducing personal discretion and reinforcing uniformity. Himmler's calm demeanor reinforced the impression that authority was steady, predictable, and inevitable. The quiet organization of power left little room for error or hesitation. Those within the network internalized discipline as instinct, shaping behavior without the need for constant oversight. And through this methodical administration, Himmler extended influence far beyond the reach of any individual officer. The machinery of fear was efficient, invisible, and chillingly effective. In this way, control became less about passion and more about precision. The impact of the Gestapo was felt not in singular acts, but in the cumulative rhythm of surveillance, observation, and expectation. Life itself was framed within the quiet architecture of authority. Even mundane routines were touched by the system, from work to leisure, conversation to correspondence. Himmler's oversight ensured that no corner of society was exempt. Yet the presence of control remained subtle, almost imperceptible. Citizens adapted, learned caution, and became participants in the very networks that monitored them. Fear was quiet, ambient, and continuous, shaping behavior without spectacle. The careful organization of the machinery amplified its reach, making ordinary life both predictable and constrained. And in this rhythm of vigilance, the Gestapo became not only a force of enforcement, but a reflection of Himmler's calm mastery. The machinery itself was the power extending beyond any one individual's presence. By the height of Himmler's authority, the Gestapo had achieved a quiet omnipresence. Its officers, informants, and administrators formed an invisible lattice that could reach almost any citizen. With careful precision, Himmler's genius lay in making fear systematic, routine, and self-reinforcing rather than loud or chaotic. Compliance and caution were cultivated not with passion, but with structure, expectation, and the quiet certainty of oversight. Every act of observation, report, or investigation strengthened the lattice, and each node reinforced the next. The calm administration of terror became both method and message, teaching the power of order through subtlety. Himmler's influence spread into homes, streets, and workplaces without the need for spectacle. And in this quiet orchestration, the shadow of authority became absolute, a pervasive current beneath the surface of daily life. The machinery of bureaucracy and fear moved forward seamlessly, preparing the way for wider actions and deeper reaches. Through it all, the calm precision of organization carried the weight of destiny. The outbreak of war expanded the scope of Himmler's authority beyond Germany's borders. As the SS moved quietly yet decisively into new lands, Poland, France, and the Soviet Union became territories where the machinery he had perfected at home could operate. With near total control, Himmler oversaw complex plans for occupation, resettlement, and administration, blending bureaucracy with ideology in ways that were both systematic and chillingly effective. Soldiers and administrators carried out policies that reshaped communities, often removing or relocating populations to suit the vision of the order. Even the smallest villages felt the weight of this organization, as structures of control extended into daily life. Himmler relied on careful planning, detailed reports, and layers of command to ensure that orders were carried out precisely. The quiet authority of the SS moved across landscapes, leaving its imprint in governance, labor, and culture. Every action was framed within a broader narrative of purpose, destiny, and efficiency. Through this meticulous orchestration, the war became an extension of Himmler's vision. And in these first movements beyond Germany, The machinery of occupation revealed both its power and its reach. Resettlement policies reflected the same careful attention to order that had guided Himmler's domestic projects. Families, communities, and even entire regions were evaluated according to their alignment with the ideology he had cultivated for decades. Ethnic classification, loyalty, and perceived purity became metrics by which lives were measured and redirected. Himmler observed these operations with the same quiet intensity that had shaped training grounds, factories, and schools. The organization of population movements, allocation of property, and establishment of settlements followed detailed plans and strict protocols. SS administrators coordinated logistics, transport, and documentation, creating a system that functioned with mechanical precision. Even as disruption rippled through towns and villages, the process itself appeared calm, methodical, and inevitable. Through these measures, the SS exercised both authority and influence, turning up into controlled transformation. And with each successive operation, Himmler's vision of a reorganized Europe began to take concrete shape. The war in this way was not only fought on battlefields, but in homes, streets, and offices. Himmler's focus on the Soviet territories introduced new dimensions to the machinery of control. Vast regions, unfamiliar languages, and complex populations required innovation in administration and oversight. He relied on experienced officers to implement his directives, while monitoring progress through meticulous reports and correspondence. Policies combined security, surveillance, and labor management, creating a network that could sustain itself across distance and terrain. The order of the SS was extended through villages, towns, and cities, creating a subtle yet pervasive presence. Soldiers, administrators, and local collaborators became nodes in a system that balanced obedience, ideology, and efficiency. Himmler believed that these territories could be reshaped according to the principles of ancestry, discipline, and destiny. He had long cultivated every act of occupation was guided by rules, procedures, and strategic assessment rather than impulse or passion. And through this quiet orchestration, the SS demonstrated the reach of an organization that had grown steadily over decades. The machinery of control was now both mobile and adaptable, extending beyond familiar boundaries. Early extermination efforts emerged from the same ideology that had structured the SS at home. Himmler oversaw the identification of populations targeted for removal or worse coordinating policy. Through layers of command and careful documentation, these operations were framed as administrative necessities carried out with a sense of efficiency and detachment. Soldiers and administrators followed procedure, recording every movement, every list, every detail. Himmler's focus was on organization and method rather than spectacle, allowing the machinery to function independently, yet in harmony with his intentions. Orders were executed quietly, systematically, with precision that minimized improvisation or error. Even the smallest unit of operation reflected the principles he had cultivated over decades: discipline, loyalty, and adherence to ideology. The transformation of communities, once slow and imperceptible, accelerated with the coordination of the SS, and as operations unfolded, the framework of authority he had built proved capable of sustaining itself in diverse and distant lands. Through calm, calculated direction, Himmler's influence now extended into the far reaches of occupied Europe. The Wien SS played a central role in implementing these policies on the ground. Units moved with precision, carrying out tasks that combined military duty with administrative oversight. Soldiers were trained to follow orders and uphold ideology, transforming even acts of occupation into exercises in discipline and loyalty. Himmler's attention to structure ensured that each unit operated as part of a larger integrated system. Communication, reporting, and evaluation reinforced cohesion and adherence to plans. Even routine patrols, inspections, and interactions with civilians became extensions of the ideological machinery. Soldiers internalized the expectation that obedience was both necessary and meaningful. a reflection of the order's overarching purpose. Through this integration, the von SS was not merely a military force, but an instrument of organized authority across occupied territories. Himmler's quiet hand guided these movements, shaping both strategy and daily execution, and in their deployment, the order of the SS carried ideology into action quietly yet relentlessly. Occupation policies emphasized control, surveillance, and adaptation. Local governance was overseen by SS administrators who implemented Himmler's plans with meticulous care. Reporting structures, population registries, and bureaucratic procedures extended influence into homes, schools, and workplaces. Even mundane routines were framed within the system, ensuring that compliance and order became habitual. Himmler's focus on detail allowed him to monitor operations across hundreds of miles, coordinating adjustments with calm precision. Officers were encouraged to anticipate challenges, adapt solutions, and maintain discipline, all while reinforcing ideological principles. Communities under SS administration experienced the quiet weight of organization, feeling authority through subtle mechanisms rather than overt displays. And in this blending of bureaucracy, ideology, and oversight, Himmler's system operated efficiently across diverse regions. The machinery he had perfected at home now functioned on a continental scale. Through this, the war became not only a matter of battle, but of pervasive order and control. Even as operations expanded, Himmler maintained a focus on reporting and documentation. Every action, movement, and decision was recorded, analyzed, and evaluated. This accumulation of information allowed for continuous refinement of strategy, allocation of resources, and monitoring of compliance. Officers became both implementers and chroniclers, embedding records into the fabric of occupation. Himmler believed that knowledge, organization, and procedure were as powerful as armies or weapons. The quiet accumulation of data shaped both policy and practice, reinforcing the authority of the SS at every level. Soldiers and administrators learned to trust the system and its protocols, creating an environment where obedience was natural and expected. And through this methodical approach, the machinery of occupation operated smoothly across regions that were previously uncharted. By centralized control, the combination of observation, planning, and execution ensured that every operation reflected Himmler's vision. In this way, the calm of bureaucracy carried the weight of destiny across occupied Europe. By the end of these early campaigns, Himmler's influence had extended far beyond Germany itself. The SS had become both an instrument of war and a structure of pervasive control. Occupied territories were reshaped quietly, systematically, and according to principles he had cultivated for decades. Soldiers, administrators, and officers acted within an integrated framework, carrying ideology into every aspect of life. Resettlement, surveillance, and early extermination efforts demonstrated the system's ability to function autonomously. Yet in harmony with Himmler's intentions, the machinery of occupation revealed a terrifying efficiency, moving through towns and regions with calm, unrelenting momentum. Even distant observers could sense the weight of an order that had grown from quiet beginnings into continental reach, and in these operations the transition from repression to a systematic, orchestrated campaign of destruction became clear. The wall, once a distant storm, had now become the instrument of Himmler's vision, unfolding with quiet, inexorable force. Through this, the shadow of the SS stretched across Europe, carrying with it both order and the chilling promise of what was to come. Himmler's vision of order and control reached a new dimension with the establishment of camps across occupied territories. These places were designed not as battlefields, but as instruments of administration, discipline, and ideology. Auschwitz, Dachau, and Treblinka became nodes in a system where human life was measured, catalogued, and acted according to meticulous plans. Himmler approached these sites with a calm intensity, seeing them as laboratories for both obedience and efficiency. Structures, schedules, and routines were crafted with precision, ensuring that every movement could be monitored and accounted for. Officers and administrators were trained to execute policies with quiet exactitude, following protocols that left little room for improvisation. The machinery of the camps functioned systematically, guided by files, reports, and detailed directives from the center of command. Even as suffering unfolded, it was framed within bureaucratic order, rather than impulse or passion. And in this environment, Himmler's influence extended deeply into both the physical and administrative architecture. Oppression. Through these sites, he transformed ideology into an operating system of control. Each camp reflected careful planning, balancing logistics, discipline, and surveillance. Himmler observed every element from the layout of barracks to the routines of labor, ensuring cohesion and predictability. Schedules dictated movement, activity, and observation, creating a rhythm that disciplined both prisoners and officers. Every report, record, and inspection contributed to a network of knowledge that Himmler could consult at any time. Orders were precise, and obedience was reinforced through repetition, ritual, and the expectation of accountability. The quiet efficiency of the system allowed control to persist across thousands of individuals. Without constant oversight, administrators learned to anticipate issues, adjust processes, and maintain order without hesitation. Himmler's genius lay in creating a mechanism where authority moved seamlessly through both structure and habit. And as the camps expanded, the reach of the SS extended beyond immediate supervision into every corner of daily life. Within their walls, this silent orchestration carried the weight of ideology into practice, shaping behavior through order itself. Training for camp personnel was rigorous and exacting, blending discipline, ideology, and procedure. Officers were selected not only for competence, but for their capacity to internalize the expectations of the system. They learned to manage schedules, supervise labor, and enforce rules with calm precision. Even routine tasks were approached with methodical attention, reflecting the principles Himmler valued most. Manuals, checklists, and procedures became guides for both action and thought, reducing deviation and reinforcing uniformity. The daily rhythm of the camps with its order and repetition shaped perception, expectation, and conduct. Himmler emphasized that consistency rather than spectacle was the true instrument of control. Officers internalized the quiet authority of the central administration, becoming extensions of its structure and ideology. Through this, the camps operated not merely as locations, but as systems where discipline and obedience flowed naturally from the architecture of governance. And in this system, Himmler's vision of methodical authority reached its full expression. Labor and routine formed the heartbeat of the camps, imposing rhythm and structure on every day. Prisoners were organized into tasks, work details, and schedules that left little room for improvisation. Each action from arrival to departure was guided by rules designed to reinforce both compliance and hierarchy. Officers supervised quietly, ensuring that order prevailed even amidst confusion or fatigue. Himmler believed that such systems of control could teach obedience, without the need for constant intervention. The repetition of work, inspection, and reporting became a framework within which both prisoners and personnel operated. Even the simplest act, folding, marching, cleaning, was measured, recorded, and integrated into the larger machinery. Through these patterns, the ideology of the SS was reinforced as a rhythm of daily existence. And as the camps functioned, the quiet orchestration of activity became both method and message. Instilling discipline through structure alone, the machinery of order moved steadily, silently, and unceasingly. Himmler also directed the collection, categorization, and documentation of information within the camps. Registers, files, and records allowed the system to monitor, evaluate, and adjust every aspect of its operation. Numbers, schedules, and classifications became instruments of power, shaping life through abstraction rather than immediate force. Administrators used these tools to maintain consistency, anticipate issues, and enforce compliance. Even small details like movements between areas or timing of activities were recorded and assessed for efficiency. The quiet accumulation of information reinforced the reach of authority, making the central command present even where no officer stood. Himmler valued this methodical oversight as much as physical control, trusting structure and data to extend influence. The calm precision of administration became the invisible hand that guided every action within the camps, and in this way, the machinery of control became both practical and symbolic, a reflection of ideology in motion. The system's quiet efficiency carried forward the weight of intention across every day. Observation and reporting became integral to sustaining order within the camps. Officers and administrators were both watchful and accountable, monitoring behavior, activity, and adherence to rules. Even the smallest deviations were noted, recorded, and addressed within the frameworks of procedure. Himmler's approach ensured that supervision was systematic, predictable, and continuous, yet almost imperceptible in its execution. Through these networks, authority flowed quietly, shaping conduct without overt displays of force. The rhythm of oversight reinforced both loyalty and compliance among staff, while prisoners experienced the subtle pressure of persistent order. Routine inspections, logs, and evaluations created a cycle of feedback that maintained cohesion across every unit. Himmler relied on this quiet discipline to achieve consistency, extending his reach without dramatic intervention. And through this integration of observation and administration, the camps functioned as living systems of authority, ideology, and control. The silent current of power moved steadily, shaping both structure and behavior alike. The camps also became instruments for testing and refining methods of control and administration. Himmler observed the outcomes of procedures, adjusting regulations, routines, and assignments to optimize efficiency. Patterns of behavior, compliance, and adaptation informed continuous refinement, creating a cycle of study and application. Even subtle changes in scheduling, supervision, or reporting could ripple through the system, altering experience and effectiveness. Officers were expected to document results, evaluate methods, and implement adjustments without drawing attention to authority. Himmler valued these iterative processes as tools for both governance and study, seeing each camp as a controlled environment for experimentation. The quiet accumulation of knowledge reinforced order, transforming practice into ongoing learning and adjustment. Through this methodical approach, the camps operated with a precision and predictability that mirrored Himmler's larger vision. And in the rhythm of these daily processes, ideology and administration were inseparable. Moving in tandem through every act, the laboratories of the SS unfolded quietly, relentlessly, and with careful deliberation. Even amidst expansion and increasing scale, Himmler maintained central oversight through calm, meticulous administration. Reports, orders, and evaluations flowed to his attention, allowing him to maintain control without direct presence. Officers acted as extensions of the central command, implementing directives and maintaining systems with disciplined adherence. The integration of labor, surveillance, documentation, and routine created an ecosystem where authority moved seamlessly through structure and habit. Himmler relied on precision, repetition, and procedure to shape outcomes, trusting the machinery he had built to function continuously. Every element of the camps, from schedules to records, reflected his approach, quiet, methodical, and intentional. The human impact was mediated through bureaucracy, turning ideology into system and order into practice. And through this calm orchestration, the SS maintained coherence, predictability, and reach across every site. The machinery of the camps operated independently yet reflected the central vision, with unerring fidelity. In this way, Himmler's quiet hand guided even the farthest reaches of his system. By the height of Himmler's oversight, the camps had become more than locations. They were instruments of control, discipline, and ideology. Every element from architecture to routine reinforced obedience and hierarchy. Officers internalized procedure as instinct, and the rhythm of activity shaped perception and expectation alike. Himmler's influence flowed through schedules, reports, and protocols, touching every life without dramatic display. The quiet accumulation of knowledge, control, and experience allowed the system to function autonomously, while remaining aligned with central objectives. Even in distant corners, authority moved silently through structure, habit, and expectation. The camps became laboratories of obedience, efficiency, and ideological application, where every action was integrated into the machinery of governance. And as operations continued, the calm precision of administration carried the weight of a terrible purpose. Through files, orders, and routines, the vision of the SS extended, methodical, and unrelenting. The silence of the camps was profound, a quiet reflection of Himmler's enduring control. Himmler had long nurtured a quiet ambition to be more than the architect of an organization. He imagined himself a commander on the battlefield. He studied maps, strategies, and reports with the same intensity he applied to administration and ritual, convinced that order and discipline could translate seamlessly into military genius. Yet the realities of war were far more unpredictable than the structured routines he had mastered. Field commanders trained in strategy and experience often struggled to reconcile his interventions with practical necessity. Himmler's confidence in procedure and ideology sometimes led to decisions that were more theoretical than tactical. Soldiers and officers adapted as best they could, balancing obedience with the immediate demands of terrain and circumstance. Even when outcomes were suboptimal, Himmler maintained the quiet conviction that the SS could succeed if fully guided by his vision. And through this persistent engagement, he reinforced the image of the Waffen-SS as both elite and ideologically pure. The illusion of command, however, often collided with reality in subtle, persistent ways. Yet, he continued to push forward undeterred by setbacks or criticism, shaping the SS as an instrument of both belief and ambition. Despite repeated evidence that battlefield decisions required more than discipline and faith, Himmler continued to assert influence over deployments and operations. He believed that rigorous preparation, loyalty, and ideological clarity could overcome experience and practical constraints. Orders flowed from his office with a quiet authority that reflected years of organizational mastery, rather than frontline insight. Officers learned to interpret his guidance, sometimes adjusting plans in the shadow of his expectations. Even in moments of confusion, Himmler remained calm, trusting structure and procedure to impose coherence. Reports returned to him in the same precise format he had cultivated for administration, each note reinforcing the illusion of control. Soldiers followed instructions with discipline, yet the unpredictable nature of conflict often revealed gaps between vision and outcome. These small divergences accumulated, creating friction between theory and practice that challenged both morale and effectiveness. Himmler's persistence, however, maintained the perception of competence even as practical consequences diverged from intent. And in this tension, the SS continued to operate as both a military and ideological force bound to the vision of its architect. The complexity of modern battlefields often confounded Himmler's expectations. Terrain, weather, and supply limitations introduced variables that could not be fully controlled through planning alone. He relied on reports, maps, and detailed briefings, attempting to shape outcomes from a distance. Officers often found themselves mediating between central directives and the realities of local circumstances. The quiet tension between command and action became a constant feature of SS operations. Himmler's interventions were measured, deliberate, and imbued with the same sense of purpose he applied to administration. Even when outcomes were unfavorable, he framed setbacks as lessons, reinforcing his confidence in eventual success. Soldiers adapted to the interplay of orders and circumstance. learning to navigate both authority and uncertainty. And through these adjustments, the Waffen-SS maintained operational continuity even as its founders' illusions of command remained evident. The battlefield became a place where ideology met unpredictability, quietly shaping both strategy and experience. Himmler's belief in the transformative power of ideology influenced how he assessed performance on the front. He viewed obedience, loyalty, and discipline as equally critical to success as weaponry or strategy. Reports highlighted compliance as much as achievement, reinforcing the notion that belief itself could carry operations forward. Officers were encouraged to cultivate morale, faith, and cohesion, sometimes at the expense of pragmatic decisions. Himmler trusted that the right mindset could compensate for gaps in training, experience, or positioning. This perspective shaped the structure and deployment of Waffen-SS units, emphasizing ideological alignment alongside skill, even when the results of engagements fell short of expectation. The quiet affirmation of order and loyalty reinforced his confidence. Soldiers internalized the importance of adherence and belief, sometimes superseding the practical demands of warfare. And in this quiet insistence on ideology as instrument, Himmler redefined the parameters of command for his organization. The pursuit of certainty guided both strategy and perception, even when reality resisted. Interference on the battlefield was often subtle yet persistent. Himmler issued directives that influenced positioning, timing, and objectives, layering his vision over conventional military planning. Field officers had to balance obedience to authority with the practical demands of immediate circumstances. Tension arose between adherence to orders and adaptation to unfolding events. Himmler remained calm, relying on the machinery of command, reports, and feedback to monitor outcomes. The Waffen-SS adapted, learning to navigate the space between ideal and real. Even setbacks became opportunities to refine doctrine, reinforcing the illusion that control remained intact. Orders were evaluated, documented, and adjusted, reflecting both intention and observation. Himmler's interventions left an imprint on every movement, subtly shaping both operational behavior and organizational identity. And through these actions, the boundary between command and ideology remained fluid, quietly defining the character of the force. The illusion of mastery extended beyond strategy into perception and morale. Himmler cultivated a sense of inevitability in SS deployments, framing success as a reflection of loyalty and faith. Soldiers internalized this narrative, measuring their own performance against ideological benchmarks as much as tactical results. Reports and correspondence emphasized compliance and discipline, quietly reinforcing the architect's vision even when outcomes were imperfect. Himmler observed, guided, and adjusted with meticulous attention, trusting the systems he had built to carry his influence forward. Field commanders mediated between vision and circumstance, balancing obedience with necessity. The rhythm of planning, reporting, and adjustment created a quiet continuity across operations. Even in moments of difficulty, the perception of control remained intact, grounded in the discipline and ideology of the SS. And through this careful orchestration, Himmler's image as a military mind persisted. Even if reality occasionally diverged, the force he shaped moved forward under the dual guidance of belief and procedure. Himmler's persistence in military affairs reflected both ambition and belief in structure. He remained convinced that order, loyalty, and discipline could overcome uncertainty and misjudgment. Every directive, memo, and report was infused with this quiet confidence, reinforcing the centrality of ideology to action. Officers interpreted his guidance carefully, translating vision into practical measures where possible. Soldiers carried out tasks with precision, maintaining the rhythm of procedure alongside the unpredictability of conflict. Even setbacks were absorbed into the narrative of competence, framed as opportunities for reflection and refinement. Himmler's calm oversight ensured that operations retained cohesion despite the occasional divergence between expectation and result. Through this process, the Waffen-SS evolved into an organization capable of both obedience and adaptation. And in the quiet interplay of illusion and reality, the architect's influence remained pervasive. The shadow of authority stretched across every operation, guiding even the unpredictable currents of war. By the end of these campaigns, the tension between Himmler's vision and battlefield reality was clear, yet unresolved. His authority remained intact, reinforced by ideology, discipline, and the structures he had painstakingly built. The Waffen-SS continued to expand, gaining reputation, reach, and influence under his steady, deliberate guidance. Setbacks were absorbed, interpreted, and used to refine both strategy and perception. Soldiers and officers adapted to the dual expectations of obedience and initiative. Navigating the subtle currents of command, reports and evaluations reinforced both the machinery of oversight and the perception of success. Himmler's quiet persistence ensured that his illusions of command continued to shape behavior, doctrine, and organization. And as the war progressed, the Waffen-SS moved forward not only as a military formation, but as a manifestation of the architect's belief in order, control, and destiny. The illusion persisted, quietly guiding both strategy and expectation into the next chapter of conflict. Wellsburg Castle perched quietly atop a ridge, its grey stones absorbing the winds of the surrounding heath. Himmler saw it not merely as a building, but as a vessel for ritual, myth, and personal aspiration. He imagined corridors lined with history, where every chamber could echo both ceremony and ideology. Nights of old ruins and medieval pageantry infused his vision, offering a bridge between past and present. The black sun mosaic at the center of the whole became a quiet focal point for reflection, study, and planning. Himmler walked these halls with calm intensity, attending to details of architecture, symbolism, and ritual alike. The castle became a private world where fantasy and ideology intertwined seamlessly. Officers and aides entering its precincts sensed the deliberate solemnity that marked every ceremony. Even the air within seemed imbued with anticipation, a rhythm that followed the quiet footsteps of its master. Through these stones and mosaics, Himmler cultivated a sense of destiny, both personal and collective. Ritual was central to Himmler's use of Wellsburg, shaping both thought and perception. Ceremonies were carefully designed, blending legend, myth, and the ideals of the SS. Participants wore prescribed attire, moved with intention, and engaged in gestures that echoed both medieval and mystical symbolism. The quiet repetition of these acts reinforced hierarchy, loyalty, and identity among the men who served under him. Each ritual was accompanied by reflection, speech, or study, encouraging internalization of order and discipline. Himmler observed with calm authority, collecting detail, refining practice, and maintaining focus on the larger symbolic purpose. Even the smallest elements, lighting, placement, or phrasing, were measured for effect. Officers and aides learned to anticipate expectation, absorbing the mood of ceremony as naturally as breathing. Through these quiet performances, the castle became a living instrument of ideology and imagination. And in its walls, Himmler shaped both perception and aspiration, fusing fantasy with authority. The architecture itself spoke to Himmler's sensibilities, reflecting both ambition and aesthetic care. Towers, stairways, and halls were not merely functional, but symbolic, each corner chosen to evoke history, lineage, and permanence. Windows framed the landscape in deliberate angles, guiding vision toward distant forests and valleys. Even the floors and ceilings carried meaning, embedding patterns that echoed order, continuity, and legacy. Himmler walked these spaces slowly, attentive to nuance, imagining every gesture as part of a larger narrative. The castle's isolation allowed contemplation, research, and planning away from the pressures of the world outside. Books, manuscripts, and artifacts were collected with precision, each chosen to reinforce a sense of continuity with Germanic myths and ideals. Officers entering this space became participants in a ritualized culture, absorbing lessons both seen and implied. And in the quiet of corridors and chambers, Himmler shaped an atmosphere that combined authority, reflection, and imagination. The stones themselves seemed to hum with the weight of intention, carrying thought forward through each day. Symbols, runes, and emblems became language in the castle, communicating ideas subtly yet powerfully. The black sun, a geometric centerpiece, captured attention and focus, guiding reflection and ceremony. Himmler encouraged study and contemplation, blending historical research with personal interpretation. Each officer or visitor was invited to internalize these symbols, translating them into discipline, loyalty, and belief. Ritual and decoration worked together, forming a quiet rhythm that echoed in daily life outside the castle. Himmler curated both objects and environment to create cohesion, a continuity of thought and mood. Even lighting and shadow were considered shaping perception and emotional response. Through these patterns, the castle became more than stone. It became a conduit for both ideology and identity. And in this immersive environment, Himmler's vision of a modern cavalry order took form. The quiet intensity of the castle reflected the depth of its master's imagination. Planning, reflection, and instruction were conducted within the castle, with the same calm attention to detail that characterized all Himmler's work. Meetings were deliberate, slow, and filled with precise observation of text, symbol, and proposal. Officers and aides learned to anticipate expectation, speaking in measured tones, and following the rhythm of ritual and discussion. Every proposal, every report was framed within the symbolic universe the castle embodied. Himmler's quiet demeanor encouraged careful thought, contemplation, and absorption of principle. Even when debating logistics, ideology, or personnel, the cadence remained calm, deliberate, and hypnotic. Knowledge and authority intertwined seamlessly, creating an atmosphere where structure, symbolism, and personal vision guided action. And through this process, the castle functioned as both administrative center and private world of reflection. Its quiet authority reinforced the larger influence of Himmler beyond its walls. The rhythm of thought, ceremony, and expectation carried outward, shaping both planning and perception. The isolation of Welsburg allowed Himmler to explore concepts that extended beyond military or administrative concerns. He imagined lineage, ancestry, and destiny intertwined and considered himself a custodian of culture and order. Ceremonies reinforced these narratives, quietly embedding ideology into both ritual and instruction. Officers and aides absorbed these lessons, often without realizing the full scope of their symbolic education. Books, manuscripts, and artifacts became tools for meditation as well as administration, guiding thought in subtle hypnotic ways. Himmler's attention to detail extended to personal conduct, attire and comportment, merging fantasy and expectation. Even the rhythm of daily life, meals, study, inspection, followed a measured cadence that reinforced both hierarchy and belief through repetition, reflection, and ritual. The castle functioned as a microcosm of his broader vision, and in this quiet cultivation of thought and habit, the boundaries between imagination, authority, and ideology blurred seamlessly. The castle became a vessel for both reflection and aspiration. Education and indoctrination within Westburg was subtle, continuous, and precise. Himmler encouraged reading, reflection, and discussion, blending historical research with contemporary strategy. Officers were guided to internalize lessons through quiet observation and ritualized behavior. Repetition and symbolism shaped perception, linking personal conduct with broader ideological principles. Even mundane tasks were infused with significance, reinforcing hierarchy, loyalty, and discipline. Himmler's presence, though calm, carried authority, subtly shaping both thought and action. Symbols and rituals acted as tools for continuity, linking each moment in the castle to an imagined historical arc. Officers learned to align behavior with expectation, absorbing lessons through rhythm, repetition, and suggestion. And in this slow, deliberate cultivation of mind and habit, Wellsburg became both school and sanctuary, where order and imagination converged. The quiet intensity of the space guided all who entered toward reflection, loyalty, and purpose. By the height of Himmler's engagement with Wellsburg, the castle had become an extension of his mind and ambition. Every corridor, chamber, and mosaic reflected purpose, symbolism, and expectation. Officers and aides internalized the rhythm of ritual study and reflection, reinforcing both hierarchy and belief. Even small gestures carried meaning, echoing the larger patterns of authority that governed both space and thought. Himmler moved among these structures with calm confidence, shaping perception and cultivating loyalty with subtlety. The castle's atmosphere reinforced ideology, order, and identity, quietly transmitting intention without overt display. Visitors and residents alike absorbed lessons in discipline, symbolism, and history, often unconsciously. And through this immersive, quiet orchestration, Wellsburg became both fortress and laboratory, reflecting the mind of its master. Symbols, ritual, and architecture converged to shape thought, conduct, and expectation. The castle held within its walls a world of quiet fascination, guiding the shadow of authority beyond its stones. Himmler surrounded himself with a cadre of men carefully selected for loyalty, discipline, and ideological alignment. These leaders became both his collaborators and his extensions, executing policies with quiet precision. Trust was cultivated through ritual conversation and shared vision, creating bonds that extended beyond duty. Some of these men established families, quietly weaving domestic life into the larger machinery of the SS. Births, marriages, and households were subtly integrated into the ideology, reflecting Himmler's vision of a generational project. Even within personal spaces, the rhythm of discipline and order persisted, shaping behavior and expectation. The calm routines of daily life coexisted with distant abstract policies of control, blending ordinary existence with extraordinary responsibility. Himmler observed these dynamics with measured attention, guiding both personal and professional conduct. The private lives of his officers became an extension of his vision, reinforcing hierarchy, loyalty, and continuity. And through this intimate sphere, he imagined the roots of a future Reich that would endure across time. Loyalty pacts and ideological bonds formed the foundation of this inner circle. Himmler emphasized shared belief as much as skill, ensuring that obedience was both conscious and internalized. Relationships, both formal and informal, reinforced cohesion, creating networks that could function even when separated by distance or circumstance. Discussions ranged from strategy to ritual, often unfolding in quiet, deliberate tones. Every act from dining to correspondence was subtly framed by expectation and hierarchy. Officers internalized these lessons, learning to measure action against both authority and ideology. Domestic life mirrored administrative life with precision schedule and subtle ceremony shaping both perception and conduct. Even personal milestones were observed as part of a larger rhythm, quietly reinforcing connection and purpose. And in this interplay between private and professional spheres, the SS leaders became both men and instruments, their lives shaped by structure and vision. The inner circle was not merely a hierarchy, but a living ecosystem of loyalty, belief, and continuity. Marriage and family became tools of ideology, as well as stability. Himmler encouraged unions that would reinforce both faith and social cohesion within the SS. Children were raised with an awareness of lineage, order, and expectation, absorbing principles as naturally as they learned to walk or speak. Even in play and education, the rhythm of discipline and ritual infused daily life. Officers observed and participated in these customs with quiet attentiveness, understanding that personal conduct reflected broader values. The home, like the workplace, became a space of subtle training, guidance, and reflection. Himmler viewed this as the foundation of a long-term project, a nucleus of human continuity that mirrored the ideals of the organization. Through repetition, example, and oversight, these families became quiet embodiment of ideology, And in these domestic rituals, the vision of a 1,000-year Reich was abstractly rehearsed. The private and the political intertwined, shaping both character and expectation. Breeding programs and selective pairing were discussed with measured precision, reflecting Himmler's obsession with lineage and purity. Though subtle in practice, these ideas permeated the culture of the inner circle. Officers understood the expectations without explicit coercion, absorbing guidance through ritual discussion and example. Daily routines, dietary habits, and even health practices were framed as extensions of ideology. Himmler observed quietly, adjusting guidance, reinforcing principles, and maintaining oversight. The emphasis was not immediate spectacle, but continuity, structure, and generational planning. Even leisure, recreation, and study carried undertones of preparation and reflection, aligning behavior with broader vision. Families and households became microcosms of the system, reinforcing identity, loyalty, and hierarchy. And through these intimate mechanisms, the principles of order, selection, and discipline extended beyond administration into the rhythms of life. The quiet orchestration of domestic existence mirrored the meticulous control of the Reich itself. Himmler's inner circle also served as a repository of knowledge, ritual, and custom. Ceremonies, traditions, and practices were preserved, refined, and passed along with careful attention. Leaders observed, memorized, and enacted these practices, linking the present to the imagined past and future. Even casual moments carried symbolic weight, reinforcing hierarchy, expectation, and continuity. Himmler maintained oversight not through command alone, but through subtle instruction and example. Daily rhythms of study, correspondence, and observation cultivated both loyalty and thoughtfulness. Officers became adept at navigating dual roles, managing family, professional duty, and ideological expectations simultaneously. And through this quiet layering of instruction and participation, the inner circle became both disciplined and cohesive. Knowledge, ritual, and loyalty merged seamlessly into the fabric of daily life. The nucleus of the Reich extended into personal spaces, quietly shaping generations. Every gathering, whether formal or domestic, reinforced both structure and identity. Meals, discussions, and even leisure were orchestrated to maintain hierarchy and shared understanding. Officers internalized these lessons, learning to balance private feeling with public expectation. Himmler's calm oversight ensured that obedience was habitual, subtle, and deeply internalized. Rituals repeated over years became embedded in both action and thought. Children absorbed rhythm, order, and principle without instruction, learning through example and repetition. Even seemingly ordinary gestures of courtesy or routines of preparation carried symbolic weight, and in this quiet cultivation, the inner circle became a reflection of the master's vision. Orderly, loyal, and generationally oriented, domestic life, ritual, and ideology were seamlessly intertwined. The private sphere carried forward the quiet ambitions of the Reich. Himmler's vision extended to the broader cultural and social life of the SS. Education, recreation, and mentorship were infused with subtle instruction, shaping both perception and expectation. Officers taught children, supervised households, and guided each other with calm authority. Even the smallest acts of order, cleanliness, or ceremony were imbued with significance, reinforcing identity and hierarchy. Reports, logs, and correspondence maintained continuity, linking private life with administrative oversight. Through repetition and observation, the inner circle became self-reinforcing, its habits, rituals, and customs echoing the master's intent. Loyalty was not demanded, but cultivated, quietly embedding expectation in daily routine. And in this careful, deliberate orchestration, the nucleus of the Reich became a living system where ideology, domesticity, and authority moved together. The rhythm of life itself carried lessons in order, discipline, and belief. Through this integration, Himmler's vision extended into every personal and professional sphere. By the end of this consolidation, the inner circle was both family and institution. Each household, each ceremony, each quiet habit contributed to the larger pattern of loyalty and continuity. Himmler's oversight, subtle yet pervasive, shaped both thought and behavior with hypnotic regularity. Officers became extensions of both ideology and administration, guiding life at home as well as on duty. Ritual study and domesticity merged into a seamless rhythm, quietly reinforcing hierarchy and expectation. Even minor details, the timing of meals, the cadence of instruction, the arrangement of rooms carried symbolic significance through repetition and quiet observation. The inner circle internalized both principle and practice, and in this meticulous cultivation, Himmler created a nucleus that reflected his vision of a Reich enduring across generations. Structure, ritual, and loyalty intertwined in the intimate spaces of life. The domestic and the ideological moved together, quietly shaping the foundation of his imagined empire. The winter winds of 1943 carried news that unsettled even the most steadfast in Germany. Stalingrad had fallen, and with it a quiet certainty that had guided the nation. Himmler, however, remained focused, quietly extending SS authority across occupied territories. The bureaucracy moved with precision, assimilating towns, administrations, and police under his control. Officers carried out orders with discipline, implementing policies with careful attention to detail. Even amidst whispers of hardship and retreat, the rhythm of the SS continued uninterrupted. Yet subtle tensions emerged, hinting at cracks beneath the polished surface of authority. Desertions, inefficiency, and local resistance appeared like faint ripples in an otherwise ordered pond. Himmler observed each report with quiet calculation, adjusting directives to maintain perception and cohesion. And through this fragile balance, the calm authority of the SS pressed forward even as uncertainty grew. Expansion of power was both deliberate and strategic, yet not without consequence. Himmler sought to consolidate police, military, and administrative control under a single vision. Territories previously managed by local authorities were absorbed into the SS framework, bringing order according to his principles. Reports of overreach, friction with the regular army, and occasional insubordination filtered back quietly, each note a subtle challenge. Officers and aides adapted, finding ways to reconcile expectation with practical reality, often through measured improvisation. Even minor failures were documented with care, quietly analyzed and used to adjust procedure. Himmler maintained his calm demeanor, relying on ritual habits and oversight to preserve cohesion. Yet the juxtaposition of ambition and circumstance created a tension subtle but persistent. The rhythm of expansion carried the shadow of risk, quietly shaping perception and action. And through this cautious advance, cracks began to form, whispering of limits and unforeseen consequences. In newly controlled regions, the SS presence was visible yet disciplined. Towns, offices, and police stations reflected an orderly framework blending ideology with administration. Citizens observed routines, patrols, and inspections with quiet attentiveness, sensing authority without overt spectacle. Himmler's officers implemented policies systematically enforcing loyalty, obedience, and compliance. Yet, in remote areas, resistance simmered, and logistical gaps challenged even the most meticulous planning. Friction between SS and traditional military units became apparent, subtle disputes arising over resources, strategy, and priority. Himmler's reports framed these tensions as manageable, emphasizing continuity and structure. Even when orders were adapted locally, the perception of control remained intact. And through these measured actions, the SS continued to extend its reach, though faintly frayed at the edges. The calm of authority masked an underlying instability quietly shaping the rhythm of occupation. The defeat at Stalingrad weighed heavily on strategic planning and morale. Officers reported shortages, exhaustion, and hesitation with a measured tone, neither dramatic nor dismissive. Himmler interpreted these reports with careful calculation, adjusting directives while preserving the illusion of omniscience. Even small inefficiencies became opportunities for refinement, instruction, and subtle correction. The interplay between ideology, procedure, and circumstance grew more complex, requiring attention and adaptation. Soldiers and administrators absorbed these expectations, balancing obedience with practical challenges on the ground. Quietly, the SS continued to function as an organized network, though each success carried the weight of mounting pressure. Desertion, fatigue, and tension were whispered realities acknowledged but not emphasized. And in this delicate balance between ambition and circumstance, the authority of Himmler's SS began to show the first signs of strain. The rhythm of control persisted, but shadows had begun to settle at its edges. Himmler's interactions with the regular army reflected a tension, both personal and institutional. Coordination required negotiation, compromise, and quiet insistence, even as egos and hierarchy created subtle friction. Reports and meetings reflected both compliance and silent resistance, with officers walking a fine line between loyalty and practicality. Himmler's calm demeanor masked irritation, his focus on procedure and ideology, allowing him to navigate disputes without overt confrontation. Small adjustments to orders, timing, and responsibility were made with deliberate care. Officers learned to anticipate expectation, balancing personal initiative with obedience to authority. Even as cracks appeared, the perception of unity remained largely intact, a testament to discipline and hierarchy. And through this quiet negotiation, the SS retained its reach, even as the pressures of overextension and conflict became evident. The tension between aspiration and reality grew, shaping both decision and outcome. The calm of administration began to meet the friction of circumstance in subtle, persistent ways. Occupying forces faced challenges beyond strategy and supply. Local populations, weather, and terrain created obstacles that could not be fully anticipated or controlled. Himmler relied on reports and observation to guide adjustments, trusting procedure over impulse. Officers adapted quietly, often improvising to maintain rhythm, cohesion, and perception. Even small failures or delays were absorbed into the larger system, analyzed for lessons, and quietly corrected. The authority of the SS persisted in part because discipline and routine were internalized at every level. Yet the cumulative weight of overextension, fatigue, and local resistance created undercurrents that could not be ignored. Himmler's calm oversight preserved cohesion, but the edges of control began to fray. And through these subtle tensions, the cracks in the facade became perceptible, hinting at the limits of even meticulous power. The tide had begun to shift quietly, inexorably. Reports from the front lines revealed both obedience and strain. Units remained structured, disciplined, and ideologically aligned. Yet signs of exhaustion and hesitation were quietly noted. Himmler processed these observations methodically, issuing corrections while maintaining authority. Communication flowed through established channels, allowing adaptation without loss of perceived control. Officers absorbed guidance, balancing the abstract vision of command with immediate realities. Even when operations faltered, the SS continued to function as a system, preserving structure and hierarchy. Yet beneath the surface, the rhythm of authority faced subtle disruption, a quiet tension between order and circumstance. Himmler's meticulous attention held these forces together, but the weight of prolonged conflict began to register. And in the calm yet careful observation of reports, the first signs of erosion appeared. Faint yet persistent, the tide of power was turning, reshaping both opportunity and constraint. By the end of this period, the SS had extended influence across Europe. Yet, the strains of overreach were undeniable. Desertions, local resistance, and friction with the army hinted at limits. Despite discipline and oversight, Himmler's calm authority continued to guide action, blending procedure, ideology, and subtle adjustments. Officers internalized expectations, balancing obedience with the practicalities of geography, weather, and morale. Ritual reporting and hierarchy preserved continuity even as tension grew. The machinery of control remained intact, yet small fractures whispered of vulnerabilities. Himmler's vision pressed onward, expanding, consolidating, and adapting, even as reality imposed constraints. And through this delicate balance, the SS navigated the quiet turning point of history, moving from the height of power toward the uncertainty of decline. The tides had shifted subtly, signaling the beginning of a slow unraveling. The winter of 1944 pressed cold and grey against the edges of Germany, a reflection of the empire's faltering heart. Himmler, once meticulous and methodical, began seeking guidance in forms that were quiet, strange, and inward-looking. Ancient manuscripts, mystical rituals, and occult consultations occupied hours that had once been devoted to administration and oversight. He moved through his papers and tomes with a calm intensity, as if the arcane could restore certainty where reality faltered. Officers observed quietly, noting the transformation without comment, learning to navigate the rhythm of ritual alongside command. Orders once grounded in logic and procedure grew abstract, fervent, and increasingly divorced from the practicalities of war. The machinery of the SS continued to function, but its master now drifted in a subtle haze of expectation and superstition. Reports arrived in orderly stacks, yet the interpretations applied to them were filtered through the lens of mysticism. Himmler's focus shifted from concrete results to symbolic meaning, weaving destiny into every decision. And through this quiet preoccupation, the calm authority that had guided the SS began to fray at the edges. Consultations with astrologers, seers, and occult advisors became part of daily routine. Himmler studied charts, read prophecies, and listened to interpretations of fate with measured patience. Officers adapted, carrying out directives while quietly observing the subtle delusions of their leader. Even routine operational decisions were informed by mystical expectation, blending symbolism with logistics in ways that were often intangible. The rhythm of administration continued, yet under it lay a growing dissonance between belief and reality. Decisions made in this period carried an abstract weight, reflecting hope, fear, and an obsession with destiny. The quiet fascination with the arcane subtly reshaped priorities, guiding attention away from immediate practical concerns. Himmler's personal discipline remained, but it was now directed toward interpretation rather than execution. And through this focus a calm tension developed, one that rippled quietly through the structures of power around him. The fading certainty of the Reich mirrored the drifting focus of its architect. Orders became increasingly absolute, delivered with calm insistence, but divorced from feasibility. Himmler demanded loyalty and compliance, expecting both ritual and action to align seamlessly. Officers executed instructions with disciplined quiet, balancing obedience with the practical limitations of war. Even as resources diminished, the rhythm of reporting, documentation, and oversight persisted, carrying the illusion of control. Decisions were guided by superstition, myth, and internalized principle, often ignoring the shifting realities of the front. Subtle signs of strain, miscommunication, delays, and minor failures were absorbed, but quietly magnified in interpretation. Himmler's personal demeanor remained serene, yet the disconnect between expectation and circumstance grew more pronounced. The SS continued to function with habitual precision, though its master had begun to wander mentally into abstraction. And in this quiet departure from practicality, the calm authority of the past began to erode slowly. The empire's machinery persisted, but its conductor had lost the rhythm. Isolation became a refuge and a trap for Himmler. Wills offices and private study offered shelter for contemplation, divination, and ritual. Hours passed in quiet examination of symbols, ancestral texts, and esoteric references. Staff and officers adapted, balancing obedience with subtle observation, quietly measuring the distance between instruction and reality. The rhythm of daily work continued, yet under it ran a layer of dreamlike expectation. Even the cadence of reporting, meetings, and planning was now infused with abstraction, linking action to mystic principle. The boundaries between ideology, administration, and superstition blurred, carrying subtle tension through the hierarchy. Himmler's calm demeanor masked increasing obsession, and those around him learned to follow quietly, without questioning the drift. And in this space of ritual, study, and observation, the empire's pulse continued with careful regularity. Even as the master's mind wandered, reality and expectation began to move in different rhythms, creating a quiet friction. Personal rituals became more elaborate, blending the domestic, ceremonial, and mystical. Himmler measured every detail from dress to schedule to the timing of prayers or study. Officers and aides moved alongside these rhythms, silently participating in the evolving structure. Even the smallest gestures were interpreted as omens, tokens, or instruments of influence. The rhythm of the SS continued externally, but internally it followed an increasingly private logic. Mistakes or delays were reframed through symbolic interpretation, creating calm yet abstract patterns of cause and effect. Subtle obsession extended to lineage, ancestry, and ritualized instruction, intertwining personal and organizational life. Himmler's authority remained intact, but the foundation of its certainty grew fragile, relying on habit and obedience rather than clarity. And through these quiet measured practices, a sense of otherworldly expectation shaped the actions of men who once relied on concrete leadership. The calm of ritual became both guidance and displacement, a substitute for certainty in a changing world. Reports from the front carried shadows of failure, yet Himmler interpreted them through layers of abstraction. Losses, retreats, and logistical challenges were reframed as lessons in destiny or signs of alignment with fate. Officers adapted, translating mystical directive into practical execution with quiet attention. Even as the Reich's position weakened, the rhythm of orders reporting and inspection persisted with habitual calm. Small signs of rebellion, hesitation, or desertion were quietly noted, but often explained away through symbolic reasoning. Himmler's mind navigated these contradictions with serene concentration, seeking coherence in a landscape of uncertainty. The machinery of control continued, sustained by habit, discipline, and obedience, even as clarity slipped away. And in the quiet adjustment between perception and reality, the authority of the SS persisted. Though increasingly hollow, subtle tension hung beneath every directive, a faint discord threading through routine. The master's focus had become a private world, both powerful and fragile. Even meetings and councils reflected this quiet drift into abstraction. Discussions, mixed strategy, reports, and mystical interpretation with an ease that blurred conventional boundaries. Officers spoke carefully, aware that practical advice might be interpreted symbolically, and that obedience remained paramount. Decisions were delivered with calm insistence, yet the logic was sometimes enigmatic, drawn from the arcane rather than experience. Rhythm, habit, and discipline preserved functionality, sustaining both administration and perception. The calm of presentation masked an internal unraveling, a mind searching for certainty through ritual rather than calculation. Subtle observation and quiet reflection guided officers' actions, as they balanced loyalty with practicality. And through this measured interaction, the SS continued to operate. Even as the mind directing it wandered from the familiar path of reason, reality and ritual intertwined, shaping both thought and action. The quiet of authority persisted, even amidst delusion. By the close of this period, Himmler's drift had become pronounced, yet largely contained within structure. The SS machinery continued to function with habitual rhythm, while its master's focus roamed among ancient symbols, prophecy, and mystical expectation. Officers observed, adapted, and executed quietly, maintaining order and hierarchy. Even minor disruptions were absorbed and translated into symbolic or abstract meaning. The calm authority of the past persisted externally, yet internally it was strained by obsession, abstraction, and delusion. Daily life, ritual, and administration intertwined, creating a hypnotic rhythm that sustained functionality despite the shifting mental landscape. And through this careful orchestration, the empire's machinery pressed on, even as clarity and realism faded from its master. Subtle tension, quiet strain, and ritualized expectation guided the next moments of decision. The failing saucer remained serene, yet the currents beneath him hinted at fracture. Time and circumstance moved forward, gently steering the narrative toward inevitable unraveling. By early 1945, the tides of war had turned decisively against Germany, and the certainty that had guided Himmler began to erode. The defeat at the Eastern Front and the relentless push of Allied forces created an anxious silence in Berlin and the occupied territories. Himmler, ever ambitious, quietly sought alternatives, opening secret channels to the Western Allies in hope of preserving himself and the SS. Messages were sent with careful discretion, couched in formal language, measured and deliberate. Officers around him noticed subtle shifts in tone, quiet consultations that differed from usual procedure. The weight of responsibility remained, yet a faint tension, almost imperceptible, ran beneath every directive. Himmler moved, as though navigating between two worlds, one of loyalty to Hitler, another of emerging self-preservation. Even the ritualized rhythm of the SS officers seemed touched by uncertainty, a calm overlay on an undercurrent of apprehension. And through this quiet maneuvering, the first hints of personal ambition began to take precedence over ideological consistency. The shadow of betrayal spread subtly like mist over a still landscape. Meetings with potential intermediaries were conducted with the utmost discretion. Himmler relied on trusted aides, intermediaries who navigated the delicate balance between secrecy and obedience. Instructions were precise, carefully phrased, and intended to leave no trace that could compromise the effort. Yet, even in quiet, calculated exchanges, there was a weight of risk, an invisible tension threading through each action. Officers followed procedure, as they always had, but a subtle sense of deviation lingered in their awareness. Himmler's calm demeanor never faltered, though the purpose behind his composure had quietly shifted. The machinery of administration hummed along, maintaining the rhythm of daily operation, while hidden currents flowed beneath it. Each written message, each carefully phrased inquiry carried the faint thrill and fear of clandestine ambition. And through this quiet network of negotiation, the master of the SS walked a path increasingly removed from the vision he once served. The air was dense with anticipation, yet wrapped in the routine cadence of authority. The realization that Hitler might discover the duplicity was ever present. Though unspoken, Himmler trusted in discretion, ritual, and structure to conceal his maneuvers. Every report, every document was filtered and observed with deliberate care. Even ordinary daily routines became instruments of subtle protection, masking intent beneath habitual precision. Officers participated in the rhythm of order, unaware of the full scope of secret negotiation, yet absorbing an unconscious tension. Himmler's attention to detail and procedure remained a quiet testament to the discipline that had defined his rise. Yet the internal calculus was changing. The alignment between loyalty and survival increasingly strained. The balance of power and secrecy demanded careful orchestration, and one misstep could unravel it all. And through these quiet calculations, a subtle unease permeated the inner circles of command. The calm surface of authority concealed the growing tremor beneath. Whispers reached Hitler, faint and uncertain at first, as they always do before clarity arrives. The leader's scrutiny was precise and inevitable, cutting through layers of ceremony, ritual, and protocol. Himmler, despite his careful measures, could not fully obscure his ambitions or the correspondence that hinted at negotiation. Officers felt the shift in atmosphere, the subtle tightening of oversight, and the change in tone of directives. Even the rhythm of the SS officers seemed altered, a quiet tension threading through habitual routines. Himmler's demeanor remained calm, though a flicker of concern touched his observation of reports and reactions. The machinery of the SS continued to function, but the alignment of loyalty, expectation, and secrecy had been disturbed, And in this quiet revelation, the first threads of collapse began to weave through the organization. Authority persisted externally, yet internally it began to falter, measured and tentative. The shadow of betrayal was no longer subtle. It had taken shape. Hitler's response was measured, deliberate, and unmistakable. Himmler was formally removed from the inner circle, stripped of direct access, and banished from the immediate command of the regime. The rhythm of office reporting and ritual persisted, but a quiet emptiness replaced the previous intimacy of power. Officers followed procedure, yet the loss of alignment and the absence of their master from critical councils created a subtle void. Himmler observed quietly, taking in the consequences of his ambition with careful calculation. Even in banishment, he retained formal authority over some operations, but the aura of invincibility had dissolved. The calm that once defined his presence now carried a trace of fragility, subdued and quiet. Every routine, every daily task carried the faint resonance of uncertainty and loss, and through this measured dislocation, the subtle collapse of personal influence began to take hold. The machinery of power persisted, but the master's place within it had shifted irrevocably. Isolation became a quiet companion, replacing the intimacy of collaboration and command. Himmler moved through offices and corridors that were once extensions of his authority, now echoing with absence and caution. A gentle tension threaded through daily correspondence, meetings, and reports, each step measured, each word deliberate. Officers observed him with quiet attentiveness, sensing both authority and the fragility of its remnants. Even the habitual rhythm of administration carried the faint shadow of loss, a subtle discord beneath routine. Daily reports and updates were processed with serene diligence, yet the purpose and clarity behind them had dimmed. Every interaction, every decision seemed tinged with reflection, calculation, and the careful weighing of consequence. And in this subdued orchestration, Himmler continued to function, though the ease of former command had quietly dissipated. Authority persisted externally, but the threads of trust, alignment, and influence had been quietly severed. The shadow of betrayal now defined both perception and action. The ambitions that had guided Himmler now collided with the reality of constraint. The machinery of war, the expectations of subordinates, and the scrutiny of superiors imposed boundaries that could not be evaded. Even the Kampf's directives were now filtered, questioned, or delayed, introducing subtle dissonance into routine execution. Officers adapted, balancing obedience with awareness of the fragile hierarchy and the newly altered chain of command. Himmler's calculations were meticulous, yet increasingly removed from the levers that once amplified his influence. Ritual, procedure, and discipline persisted, carrying the illusion of continuity across offices and territories. And through this quiet struggle between ambition and reality, the tension of collapse threaded through every decision. Authority remained, but it was fragile, layered, and measured against the quiet certainty of discovery. The calm of command had softened, leaving room for reflection, doubt, and quiet reconsideration. The once unshakable master now navigated the edges of influence with cautious precision. By the close of this period, the empire around Himmler had begun its quiet reorganization, distancing itself from his ambition. His place in the hierarchy had been reduced, his influence measured and mediated. Officers continued to follow routine, maintain ritual, and observe structure. Yet a subtle emptiness threaded through daily rhythm. Even correspondence, meetings, and oversight carried a faint trace of uncertainty, the echo of collapsed trust. Himmler's own routines remained disciplined, but the alignment of loyalty, authority, and expectation had fractured. Quiet reflection replaced decisive command, calculation replaced instinct, and ambition met boundaries it could not cross. And in this measured withdrawal, the slow unraveling of influence traced itself across administration, ideology, and ritual alike. The calm surface persisted, but beneath it lay the quiet pulse of collapse, subtle, disciplined, and inexorable. The shadow of betrayal carried the story toward the next chapter. The once integrated master of power now faced the fragile architecture of its quiet dismantling. The spring of 1945 unfolded slowly, yet with a relentless inevitability. As the world Himmler had built crumbled beneath advancing Allied forces, streets were silent except for distant echoes of movement, and cities lay under a quiet, watchful sky. Himmler, once the architect of vast power, now moved anonymously, disguised in the uniform of a common soldier. Each step through ruined towns carried a soft tension, a mixture of fear, hope, and delusion. Officers who had once followed him with quiet obedience were scattered, captured, or disappeared into the shifting currents of surrender. He carried with him the weight of past decisions, now reduced to memory and ritual rather than authority. Even the familiar rhythm of order and procedure no longer applied, replaced by uncertainty and careful concealment. Reports of surrender, negotiations, and capitulations reached him in fragments as distant and detached as a half-remembered song. And through the quiet streets and shattered villages, Himmler drifted a shadow of the master he had once been. The calm of anonymity settled around him, a fragile cloak against reality. His movements were deliberate, each town and train station carefully considered, yet guided more by instinct than strategy. Himmler's mind wandered constantly, reflecting on negotiations that had failed, allegiances that had broken, and the empire that no longer existed. The uniform he wore, plain and unremarkable, became both shield and symbol, a soft mask for the fading echo of power. Those he encountered were weary, quiet, and brief in conversation, yet they unconsciously registered the faint presence of authority. Himmler adjusted to this new rhythm, moving slowly through rubble-strewn streets and abandoned offices, attentive to both opportunity and danger. Even as the world crumbled around him, he clung to the quiet hope that some negotiation might still secure safety or influence. The cadence of walking, hiding, and observing became a hypnotic routine, a substitute for the order he had once imposed. And through this muted journey, the contrast between his former dominion and present invisibility stretched too, a quiet tension threading through every step. The empire he had built existed now only in thought, ritual, and memory. Reality whispered gently, but he moved as if in another quieter realm. Occasionally, fragments of former subordinates or soldiers appeared in the ruins, their faces a mixture of recognition and distance. Himmler greeted them with calm, careful words measured in tone and content. He offered direction or advice only when necessary, and even then it was subdued, ritualized, and symbolic. They observed his manner, noted the uniform, and proceeded with quiet compliance or avoidance, never lingering in conversation. Each encounter reinforced the dissonance between past and present, between authority once wielded and invisibility now assumed. Rumors and reports filtered softly through fragmented networks, providing Himmler with partial understanding of Germany's collapse. Even as communication became scarce and unreliable, he relied on subtle cues, letters, and intercepted messages to guide movement. And through this fragile connection to the world he had controlled, he maintained a quiet semblance of structure, even if it existed only in imagination. Each day became a measured navigation of ruins, uncertainty, and instinct. The rhythm of survival replaced the rhythm of command, gentle and persistent. Food, shelter, and basic necessities were sought, with a calm precision, each choice weighed against visibility and exposure. Himmler moved through villages and countryside quietly, selecting inns or farmhouses where anonymity could be maintained. Occasionally townsfolk glanced at the uniform, sensing authority without comprehension of identity. A subtle and almost imperceptible acknowledgement, the faint tension of risk threaded through every meal, every interaction, and every night spent under the quiet sky. Letters, instructions, and messages from the past seemed distant and irrelevant, fragments of another world. Even as he sought to maintain composure, moments of reflection revealed the distance between intention and circumstance. The rhythm of walking, observation, and concealment became hypnotic, each movement deliberate and measured. And through this careful routine, Himmler preserved a fragile connection to existence, moving quietly through ruins, both physical and emotional. Survival replaced ambition as the primary focus, though faint hope lingered beneath conscious thought. The calm persistence of movement became both method and meditation. The landscapes through which he passed were hushed, dotted with abandoned homes, shattered streets, and silent forests. Himmler's thoughts returned often to the plans he had once made, rituals he had conducted, and orders he had issued. These memories carried a soft resonance, a reminder of a reality that no longer existed. Officers who had once obeyed now moved independently. Lost in the disintegration of hierarchy and empire, Himmler adapted to their absence, relying on personal discipline and quiet instinct to navigate each day. Even when encountering Allied patrols or checkpoints, he moved with careful observation, maintaining calm and avoiding attention. The rhythm of survival was measured and deliberate, replacing the familiar cadence of command. And through this quiet attentiveness, Himmler managed to traverse the remnants of Germany with minimal confrontation, a ghost among ruins. Each step was deliberate, each breath a measured engagement with a world turned upside down. The calm of walking through shadowed towns became a meditation on both memory and necessity. He still imagined negotiations, messages, and possibilities that might restore him to some position of security or influence. These fantasies were measured and deliberate, a private rhythm that guided thought and action without external acknowledgement. Even in the ruins, he maintained careful observation of others, noting expressions, routines, and possibilities with subtle calculation. The quiet persistence of hope, however fragile, shaped movement, timing, and decisions. Officers who crossed his path observed his demeanor, noting calm focus even as power had dissolved. The streets, fields, and towns became a muted landscape, a stage for the quiet persistence of ritual, habit, and instinct. Himmler's uniform served as both shield and symbol, marking him as something familiar yet unremarkable. And through this interplay of concealment and presence, he navigated the final days of the Reich with disciplined persistence. Survival became the rhythm, observation, the method, and hope, a quiet companion. The world around him whispered change, and he drifted alongside it, attentive yet removed. In moments of solitude, Himmler reflected on the expanse he had once controlled, the hierarchy he had orchestrated, and the ideology he had enforced. The quiet of abandoned offices and ruined cities allowed contemplation. Without interruption or judgment, he measured each thought, each memory, and each decision against the stark reality of loss and exposure. The rhythm of survival, observation, and concealment continued, soft yet persistent. Letters, reports, and ritualized habits now existed more as anchors than directives, reminders of order in a world without structure. Officers, subordinates, and soldiers were absent, captured, or invisible, leaving a muted echo of formal authority. And through this quiet reflection, Himmler's movements remained deliberate, methodical, and hypnotic, a private choreography in the midst of chaos. Each step through ruins was measured, each breath attuned to possibility and risk. The calm persistence of thought guided him, a faint compass in a landscape of uncertainty. Memory and habit became companions where power had vanished. By the close of this period, Himmler was fully reduced to a shadow of his former self. The uniform masked identity. The towns whispered quiet passage, and the roads carried him like a slow river through the remnants of empire. Orders, reports, and influence no longer flowed from him. Only instinct, ritual, and observation directed movement. He drifted through villages, forests, and abandoned stations with calm precision, a ghost of a master among the quiet ruins. Hope remained faint, abstract, and carefully measured, guiding him with gentle persistence. Even in solitude he observed, noted, and calculated, maintaining rhythm in the absence of authority. The silence of collapsed cities, empty fields, and shattered homes was a companion as enduring as memory. And through this final navigation, the quiet persistence of habit, reflection, and survival defined each moment. Reality pressed gently, inexorably, but he moved through it with measured hypnotic rhythm. The empire builder had become a fugitive in uniform, drifting softly through the echoes of his own creation. The spring of 1945 gave way to a silence heavy with the weight of endings. Cities lay in ruins, roads stretched empty, and the rhythm of life moved cautiously through fractured landscapes. Himmler, once a master of order, found himself finally in the hands of those whose authority he could not navigate. The British captured him quietly, the process measured, formal, and devoid of spectacle. He wore the uniform of a soldier, a mask of anonymity that no longer carried power or influence. Officers and guards observed him with calm attentiveness, recognizing the history embedded in his presence without fanfare or emotion. The meticulous planning that had guided his life had dissolved into procedural forms, interviews, and verification. Each step of interrogation was methodical, questions posed with soft precision, responses weighed and recorded. And through the corridors of containment the contrast between former mastery and present vulnerability grew palpable. The quiet rhythm of control had shifted entirely beyond his hands. Himmler moved through rooms with the same careful, deliberate gait he had maintained for decades. Even now he measured each step, each glance, and each gesture with precise calm. Documents, questions, and formalities surrounded him, yet they carried no influence, no leverage. The air was still, punctuated only by soft footsteps, and measured words exchanged among the British officers. In these final interactions, Himmler's attention lingered on order, hierarchy, and procedure, as if the world itself could be structured once more. Officers noted his composure, the quiet steadiness that had defined him, but beneath it lay tension, awareness, and a subtle resignation. He spoke sparingly, responses calm, almost ritualistic, as though following a private cadence of discipline. And through this measured interaction, the enormity of his collapse was quietly reflected. A life once orchestrated now contained within formality. Authority had vanished, leaving only presence and history. The silent rhythm of observation persisted, unbroken by power. The interrogation continued with soft precision, each question and answer measured like a ritual. Himmler's mind, accustomed to control, sought patterns and order even where none existed. He noted details, observed reactions, and adjusted posture with quiet discipline. Officers recorded facts, cross-referenced statements, and maintained procedural calm. The contrast between the former architect of terror and this contained figure was subtle, yet undeniable. Each pause, gesture, and whispered exchange carried meaning, though the meaning was now external rather than commanded. Even in the quiet intensity of questioning, Himmler maintained serenity, though the foundation of influence had disappeared. And through this rhythm of formal observation, the final chapters of his meticulously ordered existence were unfolding. The quiet of circumstance replaced the cadence of command. The echoes of past power lingered faintly, almost imperceptibly. Within the small confines of captivity, Himmler reflected on the life he had built and the empire that had dissolved. Ritual, discipline, and planning had once governed every corner of his world, and now those patterns seemed faint shadows. He traced sequences in thought, imagined outcomes, and reviewed orders as though rehearsal could restore them. Even the faintest rhythm of command now existed only in memory, a ghostly cadence without physical manifestation. Officers noted composure and attentiveness, yet a subtle tension underlay every action, a sense of inevitable closure. Decisions and calculations that once influenced thousands were now reduced to internal reflection, quiet, private, and intangible. And through this subdued reflection, Himmler maintained a calm that contrasted with the disintegration of the world around him. The rhythm of his life had narrowed to thought, habit, and the faint hope of some residual control. Each heartbeat, each breath became the soft cadence of existence itself. The quiet of finality settled gently around him, pervasive and inescapable. In the moments leading to the end, Himmler's preparation was precise and deliberate. Even the final act, though clandestine, followed an internal pattern, a private adherence to habit and ritual. Officers maintained procedural calm, unaware of the subtle movements that would determine the conclusion of a life. Once defined by control, Himmler's hands, gestures, and measured actions carried the weight of decades of meticulous discipline. Even as opportunity dissolved reality into inevitability, he maintained serenity, focusing inward, tracing patterns and anticipating outcomes. The environment remained quiet, dominated by soft footsteps, low voices, and the subtle rhythm of routine. And in this gentle measured space, the final act unfolded with a calm precision, but mirrored a lifetime of methodical movement. Authority was gone, influence dissolved, and yet ritual persisted. The contrast between past mastery and present helplessness was quiet, profound, and complete. The silence around him carried both weight and release, gentle as a soft breath. As the final moments approached, Himmler's awareness narrowed, turning inward to thought, memory, and calculation. The rhythm of life contracted to the smallest details, the sensation of breath, the alignment of posture, the quiet pulse of time. Even as officers moved, spoke, and documented with calm precision, he existed in a suspended private focus. The vast networks of command, hierarchy, and ritual that had once defined his existence were now reduced to memory and reflection. His mind traced sequences, revisited strategies, and considered outcomes in the quiet hush of inevitability. The weight of loss, collapse, and diminished influence pressed gently, but inexorably, a subtle gravity that required no words. And through this internal cadence, Himmler's life moved toward its final resolution, methodical, quiet, and deliberate. The rhythm of existence had narrowed to thought, preparation, and the inevitable conclusion. Even the vastness of history seemed to contract around him, soft and inevitable. The calm of the moment settled over everything, unbroken and complete. The act itself was brief, precise, and carried out with quiet composure. Himmler's life ended with the same meticulous attention to detail that had defined decades of command. Officers responded with procedural calm, noting facts, recording sequences, and observing without fanfare. The stillness of the room was profound, filled with the weight of absence and reflection rather than spectacle. Even the finality of death maintained a gentle, almost hypnotic rhythm, echoing the order he had once imposed externally. Observers recorded the event, but the drama remained muted, the collapse of influence and life quietly absolute. And through this measured conclusion, the irony of his existence was quietly present. The man obsessed with control died beyond control, leaving only the faint echoes of authority. The rhythm of life, obedience, and hierarchy that once flowed through him ended in soft, complete silence. The world continued, indifferent yet measured, carrying the remnants of his story. Calm descended, pervasive and absolute, over a life meticulously orchestrated and quietly concluded. In the aftermath, the space was still, the weight of history and consequence hanging gently. Himmler's life, once a symphony of order, ritual, and authority, had ended in the simplest, quietest terms. Officers and records would note facts, reconstruct sequences, and catalogue the final moments. But the human aspect remained intimate, silent, and reflective. The empire he built had dissolved, leaving a hushed resonance, a subtle echo of ambition, calculation, and ritual. Even the ruins of Germany, the scattered offices and shattered towns carried faint memory, as though absorbing the quiet departure of a man who once shaped them. And through this calm conclusion, the lesson was subtle, profound, and lingering. Power is fragile, influence temporal, and life ultimately beyond full orchestration. The quiet of finality persisted, a gentle echo across time and space. Authority and obsession, meticulous planning and ambition, dissolved into the soft rhythm of absence. And as the world moved forward, Himmler's life became a whisper, a measured cadence in the larger flow of history. The last breath had passed, and the calm of inevitability settled Unbroken and infinite, time moves quietly across landscapes once shaped by the hand of Himmler, leaving behind traces of order, discipline, and shadow. The Waffen-SS, the Gestapo, and the network of camps remain etched in history as instruments of control, ritual, and chilling precision. Scholars pore over documents, diaries, and testimonies, attempting to reconcile the meticulous structure with the moral void it served. Even decades later, the echoes of organized obedience without conscience ripple through memory. Quiet yet persistent, the patterns of paperwork, ritual, and hierarchy remain, a testament to how ordinary methods were transformed into mechanisms of terror. Visitors to archives, memorials, and quiet sites sense the weight of what once was a presence distilled in silence, rather than spectacle. Historians debate endlessly, weighing fanaticism against banality, ideology against calculation, and ambition against human cost. And through this calm reflection, the legacy of Himmler emerges as both caution and meditation, a quiet study in method and consequence. Order persisted, yet the purpose it served remains a haunting whisper. The echoes of his influence, methodical and pervasive, linger softly in the folds of time. The infrastructure he built, now silent, speaks to the power of organization, divorced from conscience. Files, reports, and meticulously kept lists remain as cold reminders of obedience and hierarchy. Each record carries a resonance of control, subtle and precise, yet profoundly consequential. The Gestapo's apparatus, once a whisper of authority across towns and cities, is now a subject of reflection, its quiet efficiency studied for lessons in both vigilance and horror. Even in the absence of those who enacted these systems, their imprint endures, a rhythm of order that continues to inform historical understanding. And through this quiet presence, the human capacity for discipline, compliance, and ritual reveals both strength and vulnerability. Scholars trace connections, examine the interplay of ideology and administration, and reflect on the eerie calm with which commands flowed. Each layer of bureaucracy, ritual, and organization carries the faint echo of a mind that sought to shape reality itself. The quiet persistence of method, once so potent, now serves as a subtle warning across generations, and so the legacy endures, measured and reflective in archives, memory, and study. Even the camps, though dismantled and abandoned, speak softly through memory and witness. Memorials mark spaces of absence, of lives once present and now lost to history's quiet ledger. Visitors tread carefully, sensing the weight of order, discipline, and control that once dictated daily life in these places. Documentation and testimonies layer together, forming a silent, persistent rhythm of understanding. Scholars consider Himmler's role tracing decisions, orders, and organizational structures with meticulous attention. The quiet reflection reveals a paradox. Efficiency and bureaucracy applied without conscience created vast consequences. With subdued methodical precision, families, survivors, and historians carry these echoes, internalizing the subtle lessons of human behavior, obedience, and moral choice. And through the hushed spaces of memory, one can trace the quiet imprint of method, ideology, and ritual left by him. The resonance is persistent, neither loud nor sensational, but steady and inescapable. In this gentle awareness, the echo of silence carries meaning beyond immediate observation. Fascination with Himmler's inner world endures as scholars probe the interplay of myth, mysticism, and obsession. His fascination with symbols, castles, and ritualized order speaks to a mind drawn to meaning, structure, and imagined destiny. Even in absence, the echoes of these obsessions invite quiet contemplation about how belief and method can intersect. The Wilsberg Castle, the runes, and the ceremonial rituals become metaphors for control applied inward and outward, private and public. Researchers observe the meticulous alignment of ideology, administration, and personal vision, noting the harmony he perceived between ritual and power. And through these reflections, a calm understanding emerges. Fanaticism often masks itself in routine order and gentle persistence. The quiet power of symbolism, structure, and obsessive focus is both fascinating and cautionary. Each record, artifact and recollection carries a subtle rhythm bridging past and present, method and consequence. In the study of ritual and obsession, the human capacity for belief, discipline, and adherence becomes starkly apparent. The echo of intent persists, measured, silent, and contemplative. Himmler's vision of loyalty, breeding programs, and ideological families remains an uncomfortable meditation on the domestic side of order. Men and women conducted daily routines, marriages, and child-rearing within the structures he established, reflecting both devotion and quiet obedience. The machinery of life intertwined with ideology, a rhythm of routine that persisted even amid vast moral collapse. Historians study these interactions, noting the subtle ways in which normality and control coexisted with extraordinary cruelty. Quietly, one sees how ordinary behaviors were harnessed, ritualized, and ordered to sustain systems far beyond individual perception. And through this observation, a subtle meditation emerges on the fragility of conscience, the weight of conformity, and the quiet persistence of structured authority. Even in domesticity, the imprint of ideological discipline was pervasive, almost invisible to those living within it. Reflection on this period invites stillness, contemplation, and gentle awareness of the ways routine can reinforce belief. The echo of structured life carries meaning both ordinary and profound. In this rhythm, Himmler's vision is traced softly across memory and history. The Waffen-SS as a military extension of ideology remains a subject of quiet study. Scholars reflect on the tension between soldierly duty, loyalty, and fanaticism, noting the careful alignment of obedience and belief. Even decades later, the methods of training, discipline, and ritual are analyzed for insight into human behavior under strict structure. Documents, records, and personal accounts provide the rhythm of understanding, tracing patterns beneath the chaos of conflict. Observers note the quiet way ideology was embedded in practice, order, and repetition, a persistent echo of influence. And through these studies, the persistence of structured thought, ritual, and authority becomes evident, highlighting the subtle power of organized systems over human action. Memory, scholarship, and reflection carry the legacy not as spectacle, but as measured contemplative understanding. The Waffen-SS, like the Gestapo and administrative machinery, becomes an object lesson in method, obedience, and consequence. Its echo persists in quiet, attentive study, a reminder of the subtle ways structure can be misused. Through calm analysis, the lessons endure, gentle but persistent across generations. Even as decades pass, debates continue over Himmler's character, ambition, and method. Was he banal, fanatical, or both? Scholars ask quietly without urgency, tracing patterns in documents and reflection. His life invites meditation on the intersection of ordinary behavior and extraordinary consequence. The quiet persistence of ideology and action, administrative efficiency, ritual and obsession converge to form a subtle, pervasive pattern of power. Each record, each testimony, each recollection contributes to the slow, measured understanding of a man who orchestrated both structure and terror. And through this calm reflection, the human capacity for adherence, discipline, and quiet obedience is explored, revealing both potential and peril. History remembers not only acts, but method, rhythm, and persistence, all carried out without spectacle, but with immense consequence. The quietness of archives, memorials, and research preserves understanding in gentle, measured ways. In the self-study of evidence and memory, the echoes of order and silence remain instructive. And through this persistent reflection, the legacy of Himmler endures, subtle, hypnotic, and contemplative. Finally, one recognizes the paradox that defines Himmler's echo: order applied without conscience creates its own lasting impression. Papers, rituals, reports, and hierarchy outlive those who wielded them, becoming lessons, warnings, and reflections. The machinery of control, once so precise and pervasive, now exists as quiet study, contemplative memory, and gentle reflection. Historians, survivors, and students trace the pattern of method, observing the rhythm without the power, understanding without influence. And in this calm, hypnotic reflection, the paradox resonates. A life spent seeking total control ends in absence, yet leaves echoes that shape understanding across time. Silence, ritual, bureaucracy, and obedience persist in memory, serving as both warning and meditation. Even as the world moves forward, the quiet influence of method, structure, and fanaticism lingers softly. The rhythm of reflection, study, and observation carries the echo gently onward. And so the story of Himmler closes in quiet, leaving behind a meditation on the soft, pervasive power of order turned inward and outward. The echoes of iron and silence settle over history, calm, contemplative, and enduring.